We had a good early session, executive session, and we're ready to start. We have a fairly full morning. The agenda shows it going to 1 o'clock. It may take that long, or maybe we can step through a little bit more quickly. We're going to start with a report by our Scientific Review Board. As you recall, through our whole performance review, one of the strong recommendations that came out was to find a better way to get external scientific review of our science products. And of course, that wasn't new to the commissioners. We were working on that anyway, and we've actually, the commission has had through the decades a lot of external review. So it's not a new idea, but this is more systematic, and we're really pleased that we have this scientific review. So I think we have Dr. Jim Mianelli, is he on the phone, who's going to report to us from his house.
Yes, can I just do a little brief intro
Please.
with that, Mr. Chairman? As Jim said, we formed the SRB last year, the Scientific Review Board, and we have 3 members on the SRB this year. The intent is to add one more in 2014, and then potentially have sort of a task-specific seat that we would bring on occasion. But the 3 members that we have right now are Dr. Jim Mianelli from the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, well-known stock assessment scientist, Dr. Mark Mengel from University of California, Santa Cruz, distinguished professor of quantitative biology, amongst other many talents, and Dr. Sean Cox from Simon Fraser University in Canada, who's a very experienced person dealing with particularly management strategy evaluations and quantitative assessment. So we're very lucky to have these 3 folks. We had 2 meetings with the SRB this year, and I believe Jim is going to give you a brief summary of each of those meetings and the recommendations that came out to that. I would just say at the outset that the staff was extremely pleased and grateful for the input from the SRB into our process, and we took many good points from them in the process. So just pass over to you, Jim. How are you this morning? Well, maybe he isn't there. He was there. Jim, do we have you there?
Yeah, sorry, just cut off for a second there. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Jim. Thank you. So you have control, I believe, of the presentation now.
Yeah, do you see the screen all right, the cover slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, am I supposed to go?
Go ahead, Jim.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I missed the very end of Bruce's introduction there, but just to recap on our 2 events we've had at the IPHC. In both cases, we received really extensive and very interesting presentations, much of which I think you commissioners have seen as well. So the quality, just want to say at the front, the quality and extensiveness of what was provided were quite excellent and very interesting to me personally, and I'm sure the others feel the same way. So what I'm going to do is, I assume you all had the 2 reports that we wrote from our 2 meetings. I'm going to just touch the highlights, and if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but just maybe to go through the things that were covered in the questions and the summary of our responses. Is that acceptable, Chair?
Yes, go ahead, Jim.
The longer 2.5 days, looking at the data. Let me know if I go too quickly. So starting with the first report, this is the apportionment. How it's done, I mean, it's fairly straightforward. The area proportion is computed as how much is in that area, estimated in biomass units divided by the sum of all the biomass units, just in words, and each unit is computed as a weight per unit effort times the area in that unit times any adjustment factors. And so we spent a lot of time talking about adjustment factors, and this is just the formula for the same calculation. Very straightforward type of calculation. And the Commission has asked us to look at the apportionment on the scientific basis. Specifically, is it scientifically objective for how it's done? Is it consistent with other techniques or other fisheries? And are the data and adjustments used appropriate and reliable for the purpose? So just quickly to go through some of those. Is it objective, and is the apportionment scientifically objective? That affect the biomass units, they must be unbiased, or the combination of them would cancel each other out, leading to unbiased estimates would also satisfy that condition. And just to give you a feel for what was involved, and these are covered on a number of pages in this report, is basically a smooth function for the biomass unit in area A, year Y, and these are just all the factors that go into it and how they're computed times the area over here. So we have comments on most all of these individual factors. Second thing was, are they consistent with what's being used in other fisheries? Well, our response was yes and no. Sailfish in the Gulf of Alaska use a similar approach, and actually Pacific Ocean perch also use biomass estimates apportioned by region to come up with catch limits by areas. Other areas, for example, the hake fishery off the west coast is by treaty or negotiated agreements what the apportionment is. So, there's quite a bit of variety out there on the east coast. Haddock and cod are apportioned by an agreed-upon method between Canada and the U.S. For where the boundaries are there. So there's a lot of different approaches being used, and it's consistent with certainly what's being done for U.S. Gulf of Alaska fisheries and Alaska groundfish fisheries. Are the data and adjustments used appropriate and reliable for the purpose? The data, if they're appropriate, we couldn't, in the time we were given, judge the complete reliability because it would require a lot of work, and we gave some indication of some simulation approaches. For example, hook competition, you could test that using the reliability of those adjustments using a simulation approach. And Peterson has done a lot of testing as well for different factors. Is the apportionment methods consistent with the achievement of regulatory area harvest objectives? And this is probably the most complicated question we had, I think. And the answer, yes, if you read I think it's on page 3 here. Sorry, page 6 of the report. By definition, it's true because that's the way it was designed. But then there's other situations where the realized harvest rates may be different, and we try to tackle this in some discussion of that, the biological aspects later on in the report. Are there changes or improvements that need to be made? Here we refer back to our comments on the factors for the apportionment methods. One other one was just, there's a lot used to define halibut habitat, and they've done a great job going further into shallower areas where halibut are known to exist. But one idea was to look at the depths that are actually fished to define the habitat. So using that just as a sensitivity to see how that might affect things was one suggestion. research questions and alternative apportionment methods which could be used or investigated. Our conclusion here was this is the type of thing that could be examined really well within management strategy evaluation, as you heard yesterday from Steve Martell. But our recommendation here was also that looking at it even almost, you're quite close enough now to do it, what we call areas and suites within an assessment. This is an approximation to account for different selectivities by region. And then once you've done that, you can evaluate the sensitivity of apportionment in, for example, yield per recruit or spawning biomass per recruit. So there's some fairly simple things that could be done once that the second bullet is achieved as far as areas and suites. And staff are going forward with that, I think. As far as management or policy aspects of the current approach, you know, a question was asked from the commission: is the science-based approach appropriate for Pacific halibut? And our comment here was that it's important to delineate where policy starts and the science part ends. You know, there's policy and negotiation situation, and then we did note that the acceptability of policy trade-offs was really outside of the scientific aspect. But I think that the science is used to inform the policy trade-offs, quite obviously. So that was a comment on that aspect of this question. And then what are the relative merits of adopting alternative methods, which include management and/or policy considerations explicitly? And here, you know, we're also mainly concerned with reality of what's known and how to express uncertainty when that happens was primary importance. And also, you can contrast these with the policy choices. You know, if you change the apportioning methods as far as what is scientific and biological consequences. I think the main thing was to make the division clear between what's policy and what's science is being used. Okay, so that's all I had on the first report. I'll just go through and I don't know if you want to stop here and ask questions or want to hear the second report.
So Jim, thanks. That was good and clear. We understood you. Let's see if there are questions from the commissioners on that first part. Any comments or questions? Paul, please. This is Paul Ryall from Canada.
Yeah, not so much sure it's a question for Jim, but maybe for us collectively here. So going back to what the objective was for this question going to the SRB, I'm kind of struck by a couple of comments that Jim did make. So to questions 1B and D, he said yes and no. And on question 2, he said it was outside of the jurisdiction of the SRB. And so I would agree with that answer on 2. And on 1 and B, the yes and no, I guess to me, is this really a scientific question? To me is the nub of it. So apportionment is a methodology for coming up of catching shares, and I think it's done the best it can, and maybe there can be tweaks to it that would improve upon it. But the question I would ask fundamentally, it does provide some guidance on sharing between the two countries. But is it really the method that we would like to see in place for providing guidance on shares between the two countries? I think one of the questions as well was, does it meet the current harvest policy? And I think the answer to that was yes. But I don't think that's the only harvest policy, and we've talked about different harvest rates within different jurisdictions, and so I think to me that's more of a fundamental question about what the sharing arrangements could be between the two countries. So I guess in summary, I'm not sure that this has really moved us ahead anywhere as far as thinking whether apportionment is the right method or not.
So Jim, you can answer that if you want. I think it was more of a comment at the commissioner level, but if you have a thought on it, we'd be happy to hear it.
Yeah, sorry. A couple of words were broken up in the middle of of the comments, so I didn't quite get all of it, but rather than take up time here, I think yeah, I think it's just clear that, if you want to, this is my opinion now, if you stick with just the strictly science-based apportionment method, that's in some sense negotiated and equitable, then the approach that's being used seems to be quite appropriate. But it's not to say that alternatives are inappropriate. It's just the difference would be a policy choice there, I think.
Thank you. So perhaps if this may be something worth the commission spending some time on, but let's see if there's other questions of Jim, and then we can pick this up later if we want. Anything online? Nothing? All right. Thank you, Jim. For the second part, please, if you would.
Okay, thank you. So this is a bit longer meeting, 2.5 days, occurred October 1 through 3rd. Here's kind of the list of questions. And rather than read through these, I have my next slide here. It's the same thing, but with like highlights of the same exact questions to make it a little easier or a little more entertaining, maybe. Basically, are the data sets appropriate? Question number 1, and are there changes that could improve future analyses? And this was the bulk of our report, and it dealt with data treatment in stock assessments, and these topics are covered on each of the pages. I'll refer to them rather than go through them completely. The other thing, are there kind of a separate topic, are modifications that could improve the current treatment of reference points? How should uncertainty among the alternative models be treated in the 2013 decision table results? And what avenues of model development should be pursued for the future? And then question to comment on considerations for including migration, future stock assessment, and operating models for the MSE. So our responses, you can probably anticipate, are the proposed data sets and processing procedures appropriate for the Halibut stock assessment? Our conclusion was yes. But we have, of course, suggestions for changes and improvements that would improve for future analysis. Take it in 2 parts. The first one is kind of dealing with the collection and processing part. One was to encourage some at-sea sampling in the fishery for the sex composition of the catch. We felt that was a missing piece of information that would be valuable and something that through cooperative arrangements might be quite easy to obtain. Some other explicit suggestions on that was using the total weight per unit effort instead of 0.32, because we felt agreed with staff that kind of more comprehensive treatment of all the data that are available, and also looking at total NPU as an alternative. And then, as I said before, the data treatment and the assessment is covered on the next slide here. And for this, we have sections that cover the removals, bycatch and wastage, the application of empirical weighted age. We received a very good presentation and lots of discussion on how the Bering Sea is treated with a single calibration year. Encouraged getting another year of that, but also recognize that while it's an important, obvious area when it comes to apportionment and other aspects, it is a relatively small part of the total biomass. Looking mortality and repeated recapture release, also revisions to the AIDS data, and then a list of other topics which are detailed in our report. Our main responses to the questions are modifications that could improve the current treatment of the reference points. We had quite extensive discussions on how the PDO is interacting with the reference points and basically agreed with Ian that that this has to be treated with caution because of the way it's dealt with. He agreed with the approach and proposed some alternatives that are listed on page 5. Basically, potentially looking at historically based indicators instead of a value that's linked directly to the PDO. You know, that by historically based indicators, we're saying, you know, are there periods that are that you completely want to avoid? In other words, when the howling biomass and fishing conditions were at their lowest, you know, is that something that should be avoided at all costs? Another one was dynamic B0, and I listened to one of the reports the other day on that, and it seems like they've included that already in their presentation. And that's just a simple calculation that is more empirical in that it shows the impact of the biomass had there been no fishing, as opposed to some theoretical B0 that's related to stock recruitment curve. Another recommendation was looking at the replacement yield, which is simply the amount of catch that would be able to maintain the spawning biomass at the current level. And then also looking at alternative BMSY levels under different PDO and weighted age combinations, which is basically just a straightforward calculation. Some of our recommendations. Question number 4 was how should uncertainty among the alternative models treating the data should be incorporated into the 2013 decision table results. We recommended using the long-term model. Some of the language we thought could be simplified, and I think we've seen some of the results of that. And we're very pleased with the idea of using an ensemble approach, and in general, feel the progression from last year's presentation to this year's and to the plan into the future is a good one and should be encouraged. Our avenues for stock assessment development in the future, we also encourage the ensemble model approach as we noted above, but also consider combining, and this is for future, we realize some of this is not going to happen for some time, but looking at the combining the areas of suites model, as I talked about in the previous section, and also using a spatial model with the existing movement as estimated by 2 periods now, 2 fairly extensive studies on marker capture data. So you have some pretty reliable, or at least quite plausible movement rates between regions that can be used as part of the ensemble approach. Question number 6 was to comment on the considerations of including migration and further MSC operating models. Kind of repeating the last bullet was that a spatial temporal model could be developed that uses existing tagging data. In other words, they've got quite a reasonable start, but then they could also develop plausible alternatives for factors that might affect movement within an MSC. And this could be fishing related or environment driven or other factors that might be looked at going forward in developing the MSC or operating model for the MSC. And that's all I have. So sorry for the brevity. I hope I can answer any of the questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Jim. Let's see if there are questions. Yes, one from Michael Pearson from Canada.
Actually, before I ask anything, can we suggest our science advisors, I think, who were participants, I know Robin was a participant in both SRB meetings, and I know she's on the line, and I'd like to ask her to make a few comments if that's appropriate.
Absolutely. Did you hear that, Robin?
I will say it's a little bit difficult to hear what's happening in the room today. First of all, I'd like to say, Jim, it's great to hear your voice, and I hope you're doing really well. And secondly, I'd like to say how glad I am that the Scientific Review Board has been convened this year, and I think the 2 meetings we've had so far have been a real success. And I think that's in a large part due to the quality of the people that have been appointed to the Scientific Review Board. I think their advice has been very useful so far. The only comment I really had was related to apportionment and the review that we had on apportionment. And before we went into that meeting, the Canadian Strategic Working Group had a number of meetings because I was asked to present Canada's position on apportionment at that SRB meeting. And you know, for the last few years, Canada has stated at the annual meetings that it doesn't support the apportionment method, and I wondered if I could just have the opportunity to clarify why that is. And I think what we came up with the Strategic Working Group and what was presented by me at the SRB meeting was that currently the scientific approach to apportioned biomass among regulatory areas, which the SRB reviewed and Jim just told us about, is also serving as the allocation exercise. And so that is a policy choice as to whether that is whether that approach of multiplying the target harvest rate by the apportioned biomass is the way to allocate the catch. And so I wondered if this was a year that we could start changing the language that we use to discuss apportionment, and we suggest using the word apportionment to discuss the methodology to apportion the biomass. And then the other lines in that apportionment table are actually allocation steps. So when you look at those apportionment tables that we looked at yesterday, the first 2 lines of that table, which is the proportion of apportioned biomass and the absolute estimates of biomass in each area, that is apportionment. But the other steps regarding applying the other removals, multiplying by the harvest rate, getting from the TCUY to the FCUY is an allocation step. So I'd like to suggest that we perhaps change our language with regard to those various parts of the process so that we can delineate science and policy. And I think that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. So I'm not sure I got exactly all of that, and I'm not quite sure how to clarify it. Maybe the Canadians understood that, and Paul. So Robin, thank you. So Paul Ryall's going to add on or emphasize or comment, and maybe we'll all have it then.
Yeah, well, I'll try for sure, Jim. I guess it's about Robin's comments were along the lines of similar ones that I was saying earlier. I think that apportionment is different than allocation, is what Robin's saying, and it's not totally a scientific exercise. And as one of the answers that came out of this review was that in some cases that this type of methodology has been used, and lots of others that it really is a negotiated outcome, because there are many factors that go into shares for splitting up the catch. And in the ones that I've had experience in is that where methodologies have been used similar to this, they have not survived in the long term. And why is that? I think because it's not totally a scientific exercise. It's trying to find some balance between the sharing between partners. And I think really it's what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. And first off, obviously, we're all in the room here about conservation. But after that, we're looking at trying to share a pie among some partners. And I don't think just coming up with a methodology that's totally scientifically based is the way to go about it.
Thank you. I got that over the top thing. I just didn't understand the lines in the tables, but maybe that'll be obvious when we get to that. But I appreciate that aspect, and I did catch that. So, any other questions? Or well, let's see, Dr. Lowe, you have any comments? Or?
Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jimmy and Nellie. I hope you're feeling much better now. I only have positive comments about the work of the Scientific Review Board. To me, they have suggested some things that we can try, but pretty much affirms that what we've been doing is not faulty. And apportionment is one issue. Stock assessment is the other issue. we'll always be getting more data and more models to, portray what the data suggests, which is our stock scientist has already elaborated on that quite a bit. It's the data that's telling us a story, and these data also suggest that there are certain scientifically valid apportionment schemes. And I think we have already adopted the philosophy that we would exploit proportional to the distribution of the biomass. The question now, of course, is it spawning biomass, exploitable biomass, all of the biomass, and so forth. And in the examples that some organizations have used to apportion by treaty or agreement, they deal with species that have very definite migration routes, such as salmon. We know it's born here and it goes there and it comes back. So along the way it could get intercepted, but we are very certain about the stock. So those apportionment has often taken on the concept of an agreed proportion, so long as the other party also takes a proportionally, say, lower a higher amount, so that the total apportionment is correct. But halibut is quite different. We're not very clear on a lot of these migration issues, and halibut spawns throughout its range. So the issue of apportionment by treaty or agreement takes on a different connotations and must take into consideration the scientific basis, which is how does the halibut distribute itself on the long run. We saw yesterday, for example, a historical exploitation ratio. Well, that happened because the population centers was in Seattle, Vancouver, and so forth. Alaska at that point in time didn't have a big fishing fleet, and people were not venturing that far out. So the apportionment historically took on a different concept because of population centers. Now we're looking more at apportionment associated with the distribution of the stock, which is, I think, a sound concept. And Jimmy and Ellie, is that a concept that your Science Review Board believes in, that should kind of form the foundation of whatever apportionment scheme you come up with? That's it, Jim.
Thank you, Lo. So were you posing that last question to Jim? Did you catch that question, Jimmy and Ellie?
Yeah, but I don't understand it. Sorry.
I don't either.
Then stand by, please, Jim. We'll see if in discussions it clarifies itself, but thanks for hanging on. So we let Lo get away. Was there any other questions of the commissioners for him? We can probably get him back if there are. If not, are there any comments in general on the report? Anything? Please, Michael.
Just a couple of brief comments. I just want to start by a process question. I understand I'm getting an email from Robin saying she just can't hear people, and it may be the case for others on the webinar as well. Now, are we speaking close enough to the mics? Maybe we need to be like I am, sort of millimeters away. As disconcerting as that feels, I think that's probably what we need to do, and encourage everybody to do that so that everybody on the webinar is able to hear us properly. So that's a process point. On the substance, I want to just make two comments. One is, I think, just to remind us all that the SRB is in part a vehicle for doing what we wanted to do as a consequence, or one of the products of the performance review, and that is to establish and maintain a regular peer review mechanism of the annual stock assessment. Now, Ian Stewart could comment further if he so wishes, but I think it would be fair to say that we're off to a good start with respect to how the SRB is accomplishing that goal, or seeking to support that goal in its meetings that it's had. In particular, I suppose the October meeting, where they, I think, were quite helpful. But I'd be interested in Ian's views about that a bit more. on achieving that goal of providing that kind of peer review analysis of the work that he is doing. So I think that's good news. Certainly, I'd like to hear more about that. But I think that this is an important thing that the SRB is doing that we should continue to do. On the apportionment issue, I'm not in any way a scientifically knowledgeable, so I'll be cautious in what I say. But I do want to reinforce the point that Robin initiated and that Paul echoed about the need to determine or assess further is probably the best mechanism. The SRB has a role to play, but commissioners and others have a role to play as well in trying to look more closely and carefully into how the scientific apportionment exercise plays into, or should play into, or not into the allocation exercise. And I would like to see in the SRB's future agenda, and certainly in the work of the Commission and the work of us as commissioners, further analysis on that so that we can come to some kind of considered judgment in the near future on whether and how we should change the current approach that we have in this regard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ralph, please.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd just like to make the comment that in my 20-plus years of being a commissioner, we've really missed this concept of an SRB or an SSC that the council has. I think this is a real strong feather in our cap to close this loop.
Thank you. David.
I'd just like to try and articulate a concern that I have and that I've heard with our present apportionment system. And I don't know whether I can really capture this very well, but as an index of biomass by area, it makes sense that you look at the charter data and you multiply it out by the bottom area that you think is halibut habitat, and then you try and apply the various adjustment factors that we've all talked about and contributed to for some years here now. And then you apply some kind of an area harvest rate, and it seems to me that's the real uncertain part of this. What's the rationale for a lower harvest rate in some areas, a higher one in other areas? And how do you scientifically arrive at those without complete knowledge of migration? And I think the proof that I would advance to try and bolster the concerns I'm bringing up here is that it doesn't seem to be working. If you look at the trajectories of the two metrics, the charter WPUE and the commercial WPUE in the various areas, the proof is in the pudding. The precipitous drops in some areas, the unexpected rises in others, the essentially flat nature of other areas over decades, I just don't think we know enough for whatever reason, and I can't put my finger on what the missing component is, but theoretically it sounds like it ought to work really well, but it isn't. At least it doesn't look like it is to me, because the metrics that we have aren't behaving the way you would expect they would if we were on a sound, rational basis for figuring out area TACs. So I don't know whether that made any sense, but I gave it a shot. So.
Thank you, David. No, I understand what you're saying. I think it's a good point. We'll have more discussions on that, I'm sure, as we go on. Do we have anyone online, Steve?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have a comment from Philip Lestenkopf, who notes that to more accurately assess and substantiate the current stock assessment, the St. Paul Island fishermen support the proposed expanded Area 4C and 4D setline surveys to depths under 20 fathoms and below 275 fathoms. Grounds under 20 fathoms in Area 4C surrounding the Pribilof Islands has a long history as preferred halibut habitat documented by the traditional and commercial fisheries. Expanding the setline survey to add additional stations in these areas and depths is financially viable due to the close proximity to the current survey stations in 4C and D.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Not particularly specific to the SRB, but we did talk about that yesterday, and we can keep that in mind as we look at budgets and research plans, so thank you. Anything in the room? Yes, please. Rob. I think we'd like you to come up to the, does the hand mic work?
It does, but people on the phone can't hear.
Please come up to the table if you would then, because the hand mic is not, does not make you legible, that's the wrong word, discernible on the web.
Thank you. My my question is whether the Oh, sure. Hi, Rob Jones, Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission from 2A. Did the SRB directly address the assumption of equal catchability among areas when looking at apportionment?
Did you hear that, Jim?
If I can understand the question, do we address the catchability of the survey? I was unclear which catchability.
The apportionment method relies on an assumption of equal catchability among the various regulatory areas, which some of us, particularly in 2A, think is a poor assumption. And I was wondering if you address that directly in your discussions.
Thank you. Yes, I do recall having that discussion, and I wonder if I might ask Robin to help me or someone on what our conclusion was, because it's not coming to me immediately. It's part of the, I mean, all of the factors that go into the apportionment system can be considered in some way related to catchability, but so all of those adjustments are meant to take into account to some degree the variable catchability between areas. And Chair, if I might ask, or anybody, Robin or staff, if they have further comments on that, I'd be grateful.
So Robin, I don't know, I thought I saw a comment that you're not easily able to hear Jimmy and Ellie. So he was wondering whether you had an answer to Rob Jones' question, or not an answer to it, but a comment relative to the way selectivity or catchability by area is treated, particularly when it comes to apportionment.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Yeah, I can actually hear Dr. Ian Ellie fine. It's you that I cut away to very well. But things have improved actually since people started speaking closer to the microphones. Thank you very much for that. My understanding was that there was a conversation at the meeting regarding the adjustment factors to the catchability, which is a calculation of hook competition and hook adjustment factors. So for people in the room, I guess Dr. Webster or Dr. Stewart would be better able to explain it, but it accounts for the species composition of other species in different areas that take halibut bait and so affect your ability to catch halibut. And my understanding was that the Scientific Review Board generally agreed that the approach was appropriate for adjusting the hook competition, but there could be other factors that affect catchability of halibut in other areas that don't just relate to other species. And I think in the report, the recommendation was that some simulation testing could possibly be done.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you. Anyone else in the room?
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if I might just ask Ian if he could comment on that as well. Since we're
Thank you. I thought we might ask him to comment on without reference to everything that the SRB said, if you've took issue with any of them, or if you're embracing some of them, just in a general sense, and maybe specifically that last question first.
Thank you. Yeah, good morning. With regard to that last question, I think that I agree with Robin's synopsis. All of the various corrections, the hook competition, the timing, and actually the bottom area expansion are all methods to address perhaps factors that could change the catchability from area to area. So as such, we're essentially doing what we can to correct for known factors that might be causing different catchability in different areas. The survey expansion that we discussed yesterday will actually help with this, because it will bring our estimates of catch rate by in the different zones within each regulatory area perhaps more in line with what's actually going on out there on the water. So it's actually related to that discussion. As Jim pointed out in the discussion with the SRB, it was noted that there could be other factors influencing catchability, and that we currently don't know and don't have any way to correct for additional factors, and that's where some simulation testing of how big an effect those factors might need to have before we would essentially be getting the wrong answer, I think could be useful. With regard to the earlier comments, I would have to say that I agree entirely with Commissioner Pearson that we are off to an excellent start with the SRB. I come from a background of doing stock assessments for the National Marine Fisheries Service with a very entrenched peer review process, and I find it both very useful and very comfortable situation to operate in. I think we have an excellent group on our scientific review board, and I think that the products that I was able to deliver this year have benefited substantially from the review that we had in October. You didn't see the earlier version, but many of the comments and suggestions that they made at that meeting I was able to incorporate into the product that I delivered to you this year. And I suspect as we go forward in the process that will continue to be the case, and perhaps even more so in future stock assessments. So I'm very positive about the process, and I think we're really on a good track for independent peer review and for improving the products that the staff's able to bring forward for you guys for the annual management process.
No, actually not for Ian, but just I guess another comment. You know, I do find it a little bit oversimplifying the situation with apportionment by using habitat as or the area as a surrogate for how one shares a resource. I think it oversimplifies because there's many things that we don't know, and Dave touched on them about the migration of halibut. And so and it also reminds me of extensive discussions we had within the Pacific Salmon Treaty over a similar type of process for trying to allocate fish between the two countries that went on for probably 10 years. And the same conversation that we're having here this morning about all these different factors that come into trying to figure out where these fish come from went on, as I said, for 10 years and didn't resolve the question. And I guess for me, it's not as purely a scientific question, and science can help inform us, but it's not going to lead us and provide the answer, even if we will never answer all the questions. And that's how the fish migrate out there on halibut, I don't think. And what Dave talked about as well, it doesn't seem to be jiving with what we're seeing in areas 2A, B, and C, where we're seeing relatively flat catch per unit effort out of the survey and precipitous drops in some of the other areas. And so doesn't seem to be the apportionment methodologies mapping out with how we're seeing the actual stock. And maybe some of that too, as we touched on with some of the, and we've spoken before about bycatch as well, about how that currently is accounted for, but not just accounted for, but how that is taken into account within the model as natural mortality, basically. So I think there's a number of issues around here that we should talk about that go beyond just a methodology of looking at bottom area as a methodology for coming up with shares.
Thank you. Ralph.
Paul, I guess I would ask, do you have a suggestion for a better way to do this?
I don't right now, Ralph, but I guess the reason I've raised it a couple of times here this morning is that we've talked about apportionment a number of times, and I think the intent of having the Scientific Review Board take a look at this was to provide some further guidance. And I guess for me is what I'm saying is I don't think it's really particularly helped me to say that apportionment is the method to use. And as it's currently applied, and I think Robin touched on that too, is okay, it can provide some guidance, but when you start putting it into the tables at the end, and I think that was your question, Jim, was okay, that becomes more of a policy choice. And I do think, I guess, Ralph, to answer your question, I think we should spend some time thinking about what alternative methods there are.
Thank you. And of course, and it's a long playing out process, but of course the management system evaluation tool is being developed, maybe something that would, once it's developed, be very useful to look at different apportionment schemes. And maybe there's some things we can do in the interim as that's being brought together, but I appreciate those comments. So Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think all these comments are quite germane to your discussions you have on here. I'll sort of bring forward some points that were raised in the SRB report, and one of them is endorsing some of the approaches that Ian has already had in a way, like fleets as areas type of thing, to try to bring some spatial context into the assessment process that helps inform your decisions about harvest rates and area-specific catch limits. I think Robin's point was a very good one, and if we look at the apportionment table, which is the tables we went through yesterday afternoon, she's quite correct. The first line in that table is the apportionment of the exploitable biomass. Pretty much everything beyond that becomes some decisions we make about how we incorporate various removals from the available biomass for that, and that's an absolutely accurate point. So I think the discussion saying that we have two different processes involved in that is quite correct. So the SRB, in its conclusion, said, as a way to apportion exploitable biomass, what you're doing is an appropriate thing to be doing. The question beyond that for you to consider is, what are you going to do with that exploitable biomass? And so you have various suggestions in front of you from staff, and there's the SRB has made some suggestions on how we might do that in the future. So I think it was a very good review by the SRB, and it did highlight parts of this aspects of the difference between allocation and apportionment.
Okay, thank you. Anything further on the SRB report? If not, thank you very much, Jim. That's great to hear from you, and good luck going forward. We'll see you soon, I hope.
Okay, thanks very much.
So if we can perhaps roll right into, if Greg's ready, the bycatch working group report.
Give me a moment, I'll have a PowerPoint to bring up here. Okay, good morning, members of the Commission. Greg Williams here with the Commission staff. On the agenda item here for the bycatch work group, I'll have some a review of the public comments that we've received on the report that was posted for public to review here in November. And look forward to the next steps you folks would decide on from this discussion here. As a reminder, we established a timeline here this fall for the work products of the bycatch work group, and I've got the timeline up here on the screen. But right now we're down here at this point, which is the interim meeting. The based on comments and input I received from the national sections, the report was updated during October, early November. We had our conference call on November 5th to review those comments and provide any other revisions. Although that was done, the report was posted on our website on November 11th, and with a roughly 16-day comment period for the public. We received a total of 51 comments from this period. All the comments have been summarized and posted on the workgroup website. And just a little bit of demographics on the comments that we did receive. And I should preface this by saying the actual report is under tab 9 in your briefing book, and the summary of those comments is behind the report under tab 9 as well. We received 51 comments, as I said, 49 from the U.S. that were all from Alaska, and 2 from Canada. 11 of the comments came from organizations and 40 from individuals. We had one single group comment from the Alaska trawl industry representing 5 principal organizations in that sector. However, the majority of the comments we received were from commercial halibut fishers. We did also receive 9 comments from the sport industry, both individual and lodge charter operators. These comments have been summarized and are, like I said, are up on our web page. The link is on the screen here for those watching on the web. There were a wide range of comments, most of that pertain to the report, but some that kind of fell outside the themes of the report. And just to give opportunity for those comments to get some airtime here, I wanted to just post those up for your education here. One, that the comment period was not long enough, and a couple of individuals wanted to request additional opportunity for comment after the annual meeting. Comments talking about slowing down the process, that there wasn't enough time for public involvement in this process. We had a comment that the individual had some concern about the impact of incorrect assumptions of survival on discarded sport-caught halibut. Comments about the Alaska situation, Alaska fisheries IFQ program hasn't lived up to promises, that IPHC has allowed the trawl bycatch abuses to continue. A request to redraft the report to more fully include fishery wastage or discards. And a couple of comments that kind of struck me as being, well, we should have done this. Who is on the bycatch work group? And I had to, a little chagrined at that. We didn't have that identified in the report. So that will be something to be corrected here in the next version. Next, I'd like to go through the individual options and the gist of the comments we received on each option. As background, under Objective 4 in the report, we have 7 options that the Commission and project team identified at last year's annual meeting that were agreed to. Those options were fleshed out in some discussion points, and we requested the public comments on those long-term options. And your intent was to get feedback on those to see if there were some options that should be called out or options that should have more time spent on them in our discussions. So starting first with option 1, which was to establish some updated Canada and U.S. bycatch reduction targets, there was some widespread report, almost unanimous comment to do this and looking for some immediate reduction in bycatch. However, no specific targets or timeframes were offered or suggested by anyone. A couple of folks noted that the 1991 workgroup targets were useful, but were not attained in some cases, and a lack of a specific time frame for the accomplishment of those targets was noted as a deficiency. Under option 2, which involved authorizing currently prohibited gear times to retain and sell halibut, this, safe to say, garnered the most comment of about anything in the report. It was universally commented on. One individual noted the option was lacking specifics and made an evaluation difficult. However, there's an almost universal opposition to the idea for any retention and or sale from gear types which are currently prohibited under Commission regulation. The thinking behind this was that it did not create any incentive to reduce bycatch, removes any reason to even minimize bycatch by those fisheries. There's some attendant concerns over product quality and markets, and that the current monitoring requirements are inadequate to even support this idea. A couple of folks who tried to think through the option a little bit more further noted or commented that if allowed, that revenues created by the sale of halibut bycatch should not go to the vessel but should go into research on determining cleaner fishing or to increased monitoring. As well, others suggested the fish should be donated to food banks rather than going into normal product markets. Finally, one individual noted that there should be a workshop to discuss the disposition of bycatch, whether it should be retained or discarded. On option 3, which was defining minimum standards for catch monitoring and implementing higher levels, 100% monitoring, there was numerous comments which encouraged IPHC to set a minimum monitoring standard. I'll leave it at that. Accurate accounting is certainly needed in many people's minds. This was frequently, this higher level of monitoring was frequently coupled with individual vessel accountability programs, which are obviously active in certain jurisdictions here in the North Pacific. There were several calls for 100% observer coverage to be mandatory. Now, the final comment was that the levels of monitoring should be reliable and should produce accurate estimates of bycatch, which seems to kind of back off just 100% or some specific level, but just look at the actual needs of what is required to get good estimates. I mean, 100% monitoring may not be necessary for good estimates, for accurate estimates. Under option 4, establishing individual vessel accountability for all halibut bycatch. This is also widely supported and was cited quite often for the successes seen in BC and the West Coast fall fisheries. Most commenters believe that restrictions can be easily achieved via individual vessel accountability programs because it creates an incentive for the operator to fish more cleanly and gives him the tools that they need to accomplish that. Under option 5, which are, thank you, time and area closures, I found that in reviewing the comments on this, thank you, that this time and area closures were frequently cited as something that has worked in the past, and I'm thinking that this goes all the way back to some of the foreign fishing days in the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska, Canada and the West Coast. It's not a commonly used tool right now, so it was not specifically noted as being something for bycatch reduction, but maybe more germane to protecting juveniles in general. And it was offered as another tool to managers, but it didn't seem to be the principal tool that folks saw as achieving bycatch reduction. Option 6 had a couple of ideas within it that had to do with defining areas with high bycatch as areas of special concern and reducing their catch limits accordingly, or conversely adjusting catch limits upwards where bycatch has been minimized or have higher standards of monitoring. Now, frankly, there are very few options or very few comments on this option, and one commenter noted a disconnect between penalizing the directed halibut fishery for actions going on in another fishery. Finally, option 7, which was a rather lengthy list of very specific items that could be done to reduce bycatch mortality in Alaska. Comments with this seem to be coupled with option 2 regarding the prohibited gear types and sale and retention of bycatch there. By and large, ideas advanced under option 7 were not supported. There were a few comments that addressed elements of option 7, one of which was to open the Pacific cod fishery in Alaska at the same time the halibut fishery and sailfish fishery open. Currently that is not the case. Currently cod opens on January 1st, and so bycatch in that hook and line cod fishery occurs prior to the halibut season. There's also an option within option 7 about lowering the size limit to take advantage of the larger discards as occurring because of the abundance of smaller fish on the grounds right now. And the comment with the lowering the size limit really is not supported in recent analyses at this point. So the next steps, according to the plan you've laid out here for this fall, is to discuss the stakeholder feedback, narrow down the list of options to a subset of priority items that you wish to focus the discussions on. We have a conference call scheduled for December 19th. And that, Mr. Chairman, is what I have for you here.
Thank you very much, Greg. Commissioner comments or questions? Michael?
Thanks, Jim. And definitely we look forward to, first of all, I want to thank Craig and the others who on the project team who have done a lot of good work to get us to where we are today. And thank Greg specifically for the presentation and the focus on the options that were discussed or supported as for further examination at last year's annual meeting. I would like to advise all of, some are aware already, that Rebecca Reed, who used to be the lead on the Canadian side of the project team, has now been replaced. She still works for us, but she has been replaced as the lead on this issue by Sylvie Burube, who is here in the room, and I think that was as of a few weeks ago. So I just want to welcome Sylvie to the work of the project team and to the ongoing work that the Commission has seized on this issue. Thirdly, I am very much grateful for the extensive comments that have been made on the draft report, and I'm conscious of, we've had some discussion, Jim, as you know already, about whether or not we have an opportunity to extend the opportunity for comments, and I think we should make we should provide some clarity on that today. I think we had a view that it would be appropriate to extend the opportunity for further comment. Before the annual meeting, we have a few other things that we should decide as far as the draft report's contents for the purposes of discussion at the annual meeting. But I do think we want to make sure that all interested parties are aware of the time frame around the deadline for comments. So I'll leave that to you as the chair to reflect on that before we conclude this item. And one last point that I just make is on the question of input from others. I'm assuming and hoping that there will be participants on the webinar as well as in the room here from a stakeholder community who would have further thoughts, and welcome hearing those in the discussion this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Any other commissioners' comments or thoughts? Seeing none. Oh, Chris?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. We're going to have a discussion about sort of the next steps or timing with regard to additional comment. I know I had a number of comments or questions myself with regard to the report, and I'm not going to get into those now. If I'm sitting in this seat in January, I'll certainly offer those. But I do think there's some additional information, and for example, the information from the 2013 fisheries with regard to bycatch numbers in all fisheries and wastage in the directed fishery that is relevant information that we've talked about. I know that our North Pacific Council is potentially interested in submitting comments as a council on the report. They meet next week, actually, and so I'm certainly hopeful that we can find some way to accommodate additional comment between now and the January annual meeting.
Thank you, Chris. And so I think we will get to that very directly. We'll, as Michael suggested, I think we should see whether people on the webinar or in the room have comments before we decide on when the cutoff for comments might be. But I appreciate that. Anything else at the table? Greg.
Thank you, Dr. Balsker. I did have one request through the web to tell the audience who is actually on the project team. So if you indulge me for a moment, I'll do that.
I wanted you to do it from memory.
Yes. The project team is composed principally of the 6 commissioners. So for Canada, we have Paul Ryle, Michael Pearson, and Dave Boyce. The U.S., Dr. Balsiger, Ralph, and Chris Oliver as an alternate commissioner. We also have the two science advisors, Dr. Robin Forrest and Dr. Loli Lowe. The co-chairs of the project team are Sylvie Berube, as Mr. Pearson just mentioned, and then Dave Witherall on the U.S. side. And then I sit in as commission staff support. So that basically constructs the team.
Well done. Thank you. All right. Steve, is anyone on the web interested in commenting? That was the comment. So from the floor, from the room here, does anyone have a Mr. McGregor? Would you please come to a microphone? If you don't come to a microphone, the web people can't hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. I introduced myself briefly yesterday as Paul McGregor. I work for the at-sea Processors Association. The members of our association operate large catcher processors, primarily in the pollock fishery in the Bering Sea. We have lots of issues associated with our operations, many of them good, some of them are problematic, but halibut bycatch is not one of the big issues that we have. We do have a very minor incidental catch of halibut over the course of catching 1 million tons of pollock every year. But I personally have been on the Council's Observer Program Committee for 15 years, I think it is, and I was intimately involved in the introduction and development of this new Observer Program that just went into place beginning in January of this year. And I guess the one thing I would recommend to you is that you not stand down on this issue, but that you slow down a bit until you have the benefit of the first complete year of information from that Observer Program. Because for the first time ever, we've had, I think, it's not a foolproof program, but it's much more comprehensive. The gaming issues that you heard about yesterday in some of the testimony, which were apparent in the earlier Observer Program that we had, and may be apparent in this one too, but they haven't been detected yet. But gaming was going on by everybody. It wasn't just trawlers. It was longliners. It was pot fishermen. It was everybody that saw an angle about how to manipulate that earlier program that we had for a number of years. We've got a new program now, and the data you're going to get is going to be pretty eye-opening, I think, because you're going to see bycatch problems in fleets that you never knew had bycatch problem, and you're going to see lower problems in areas where you thought you had a big problem, and that's going to be coming from a program that's a lot more credible in terms of the way the observers are deployed and the kind of information they're going to catch. So I'm not trying to put a halt to your development of further bycatch measures or recommendations, but I would ask you to look at this new information that you're going to get, and I suspect it's going to be at the December meeting of the Council. We'll get a complete report from the Observer Committee about what we've seen in the past year, not only in the Bering Sea, but in the Gulf of Alaska as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Questions for Paul? Thank you very much. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, David has one.
I just had a question. I understood, could be wrong, that the new Observer Program was designed to achieve a higher degree of observation, a higher degree of monitoring than the one that it replaced, on the order of 40 to 50% overall monitoring, but that because of unexpected cost issues that were connected with the payment mechanism, that in fact the achieved rate of observation is not much more than a third of the expected rate. Does this compromise the design of the new observer program?
Well, excuse me. I don't think I'm prepared to answer that question yet until I see the data that comes out. It's going to be presented next week, I believe, at the North Pacific Council, or I'm hoping it will be. Unfortunately, there was an observer report prepared and ready to be delivered at the last council meeting, and the day that the head of the observer program came up to testify was the day that the U.S. government shut down. He had to go home without ever doing anything other than dropping his written report off and not being able to testify to the council about issues such as the ones you've just raised. So I think we'll know a whole lot more about the success of deployment, the costs, and the ability to fund the program out of the monies that are going to be available after next week's council meeting, because that's when there's going to be a comprehensive report. And that's what I'm suggesting here to you is, you know, there's going to be a lot more information available to you about those very issues you've raised, as well as some of the ones that I mentioned. And that is, you're going to find bycatch coming from places you didn't expect it, higher levels from others than you expected, and lower levels from others than you expected. And it's with that information that will enable you to make informed recommendations about a bycatch reduction program going forward, where it's needed, where it's not needed, and so forth. And so it's not a fast-moving process anyway. I'm just informing you that you will have a lot more information available to you in the relatively near future that will help you make better decisions here.
Thanks, Paul. Chris had a comment on it.
Just an observation or comment on David's question. I think it's true that based on the fee percentage that we're able to collect and based on perhaps higher cost per day than we originally anticipated when we put this program in place, that coverage levels probably overall aren't as high as we had expected or hoped they would be. But in fact, when you look at the full coverage trawl and hook and line fleets in the Gulf, the coverage levels actually went up slightly compared to what they were in 2012. They remained about the same for the non-pelagic trawl fisheries. And when you look at the partial coverage hook and line fleet through the vessel selection pool, I think it doubled almost from 7 to 14%. And then, of course, we've got observations from the small boat and halibut fishery that we have, essentially from 0 to somewhere around 6 or 7%. So just a little clarification on that issue.
Thank you. Paul, do you want to respond to that?
I think it's along the lines. The people that I represent, the fishing vessels that I represent, carry 100% observer coverage. Actually, they carry 200% observer coverage. They've had 2 observers on board every time they put to port for the last 15 years. So there's nothing new in terms of the data that's coming off of the large boat fleet in the Bering Sea, at least the people that I represent. Where you're going to see the differences are in the small boat fleets in the Gulf of Alaska. There's a lot more vessels. They're smaller. They come from a disparate number of fishing ports all over the Gulf. The data collection program is very difficult to manage. The new program will hopefully facilitate better information coming out of it, but we won't know that until the report comes in next week.
Thank you. Paul Ryall.
Yeah, Paul, thanks very much for your comments. I look forward to seeing the report. I guess, Chris, a question for you. Will that report be available online next week?
I'm not exactly sure all the information that's going to be presented next week. That's something I'll have to confer with the Observer Program folks on, but whatever they present will certainly be made available. I don't think it's published yet. We'll be bringing it to the meeting. We'll certainly make it available.
On that, to manage expectations, I don't think that the complete observer report is scheduled until the meeting following the meeting next week. And so we'd have to get someone from the observer program to tell us that for sure. We have the preliminary information, of course, much as we have bycatch in the trawl fleets. We'll have the same type of preliminary estimates of of bycatch and the small fleets that are for the first time observed in the Gulf. But I don't think that the whole observer report revealing all the insides and outsides of the first year of the program will be available till the first meeting of the council in 2014. And so we're not expecting it next week. Well,
yes, Mr. Chairman, are we going to have somebody from the Observer Program at the annual meeting to give us a presentation and allow questions to be asked?
I haven't made that arrangement yet, but I can't imagine we won't be able to, so I'm expecting we'll invite someone this shortly. Okay, we still have Paul McGregor up here. Any questions or comments for him? If not, thank you very much, Paul.
Okay, I would just add that the reason we don't have quite the final wrap on this is the fishing year is still in progress, and it won't be until the end of the year that we'll have all the data in. But there will be I'm hoping that we're going to get a pretty good report at this meeting coming up next week about what they've learned today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Paul.
Jim, when is the first meeting in January?
It's the first full week of February, and I actually don't have in mind when we're scheduled to receive that full-blown observer report. I think I saw someone in the audience. I'm not good at reading lips, but it may not be until the June council meeting when we're scheduled to receive that full document. But I'm speculating now, so we should, rather than make any more dates up, we should find out, I guess. Steve.
Two comments from the audience. The one is a comment from Philip Lesnikoff, who says, as you now know, after yesterday's presentation of the apportionment results, in Area 4 CDE, the other removals of 2.27 is 78% of the TCEY in Area 4 CDE, and the FCEY is only 22% at 0.64 million pounds. This is not working. Comment from Philip. The second question from the web audience is, Commissioner Oliver said observer coverage is up in the Gulf. By what measure? Is that observed pounds landed or observed trips?
I'm not sure I have that exact information. I think it's the information that I was based on was in terms of trips. And it's preliminary, of course, noting Jim's note that we'll be getting a full report soon on the program.
Thank you. So I think we've completed the, oh, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Paul Olson. I'm here on behalf of the Boat Company, which is a conservation foundation that also runs eco-tours and sport fishing tours in Southeast Alaska. And I wanted to comment briefly on one thing and raise a question. In terms of the timeline for updated reduction targets, the National Pacific Fishery Management Council has undertaken a comprehensive management program. And so I think I'm not sure what long-term option and intermediate-term option means, but the regulatory process can take anywhere from 1 to 3 years probably. Dr. Balsinger, Mr. Oliver could clarify that, but I think it would be important to have those reduction targets in hand to guide the Council's decision. And one clarification, I think one of the commissioners asked a question about the amount of observed catch under the observer program. I believe it declined by 33% according to the 2013 deployment plan. That's off the top of my head, but one of the things that was done was to distribute observer coverage more widely, which meant some of the vessels that catch the largest volume of fish received less observer coverage ultimately. And my question, probably for Bruce or Greg, pertains to the objective of developing minimum standards for observer coverage, and I noted there was a thought about commissioning an independent scientific review. And I've personally reviewed a lot of scientific literature on variance estimates, precision, and accuracy, and don't claim to be a scientist, but there's a lot there, and it seems a lot simpler to think about possibly developing a minimum standard for 100% coverage for critical bycatch fisheries. I think if you review the recent halibut bycatch group report that was put in the 2012 research report, it's pretty clear that there's a strong consensus from a lot of fishery managers that this is the way to go. So I was just curious what the IPHC scientists thought about the utility of exploring what you can do with a partial coverage fleet, because it seems like it would be quite an undertaking as opposed to just doing 100% coverage.
Bruce, do you want to respond?
Just a quick one on that. I think the task that the Commission put to the staff as a result of last year's discussion of the Halibut Bycatch Work Group was to have the staff provide you with some evaluation when that final report from the Observer Program is received, and part of that might be the idea of looking at levels of coverage and whether those are not or are adequate according to the staff's evaluation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we've collected all the comments that we have on this. What would the commissioners like to do? Michael.
Thank you, Jim, and I thank all for the comments that have been received today and earlier, as I said. I do think we have a couple of decisions to make. One is the question of extra opportunity for comment on the existing draft report. So, Jim, I'll leave that to you to make a call on, but I do think from a Canadian side that we would support an extension of the deadline in that regard. I think the goal here, to remind ourselves, is that we would like to have an updated draft report that considers and takes into consideration the comments that are received on the existing draft report. That would be then reviewed by the project team on the 19th of December so that we could have available to all at the time of the annual meeting beginning 13th of January the updated draft of that report. I think we've had some discussion about this. This is, from my personal perspective, not a report which should be seen as the final say, shall we say. It is, as was requested and wished for 2 annual meetings ago, an attempt to try to provide more and as much accurate information as possible about the state of bycatch and the bycatch issue more generally in the halibut fishery. On that basis, to be able to provide some ideas and suggestions regarding how that bycatch could be managed more effectively, taking into account a number of factors, including best practices, obviously. I am struck, by the way, in that regard, when listening to the report that Greg made on the comments that were received on the initial draft report, the significant degree of support in those comments on such issues as whether it was a minimum standard, I think in some cases of monitoring that were suggested, making sure that there was, well, I think it was a unanimous comment that Greg reported about not allowing prohibited gear types to participate. I mean, there were a number of things which I thought in total suggested from those comments that, number one, there's a strong interest in trying to manage this issue, and I think that echoes what we thought we knew already. Number two, there's a strong interest in looking at some concrete actions and further concrete actions that can be taken, and I want to emphasize in that context and express appreciation to the work that Jim and his team have done in developing a new program, which is, as we've been discussing, implemented for the first time this year. And we all look forward to the further reporting on that, but I think it's important to acknowledge the effort being made already, rather than waiting for further analysis, etc., a recognition that there's a need to try to address this issue further. And I think we would all agree that we're not going to have a solution found in the year to come or by the annual meeting. But at the same time, we are very much we should very much continue to be seized of not just the issue, but in fact the options as were listed in Greg's slide presentation today, which I hope, by the way, would also be made available generally to all of us, to stakeholders as well, so that people can review what those options are, again, be reminded of what those options are that we discussed or suggested be looked at the annual meeting last year. And that, in fact, I would see this annual meeting as an opportunity to consider those various options and to prioritize amongst them for further analysis or work or implementation, so that we could, continue the momentum. I'm conscious of some views that have been expressed about, as what was described, don't stop but slow down. I don't think it's really a question of either of those. I think it's a question of maintaining the momentum of effort that we have been developing already, and to take into account, just as we need to, the additional information that we're going to be receiving for the changes in observer coverage that have been mandated in the Gulf now, taking into account, as we have been in the past, but continuing to the record of effort that is that exists in Area 2B and more recently in 2A, and the implications or impacts of those efforts, whether 100% monitoring and dockside, etc. Observer coverage, looking at those as best practices and how they can be developed further and in the fishery as a whole throughout all regulatory areas. And so in that sense, and I hear Philip's comment, and I welcome the knowledge that he's listening and participating as a former commissioner with a strategic interest in being concerned in particular about the areas that he described where he sees the TCEY as being, and the relationship between the TCEY and the FCEY is one of major concern of clearly not just him but other fishermen in those areas, to reinforce the point that we need to get a handle on this issue, and we need to show as a commission that we have a strategy in place to try to address this issue in a way that is in the interests of all concerned, for both conservation reasons and, frankly, as much for equitability and ensuring reasonable economic opportunity at the same time as we focus on conservation. So all which to say, I think it's welcome work that has been done so far, and appreciate that work, and would like to see continued focus on this by the Commission, and in particular, as we did last year at the annual meeting, to come out of this coming annual meeting with yet further direction that we want to give on next steps for this work. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think that's right. This report will end at some time. We'll try to sign it, but we aren't going to stop collecting data. We're not going to stop learning new things either about biology, migration, or bycatch, so we need to continue to collect all of that. So from a pragmatic point here, to try to get past this, I suggest that we find some extended deadline so at least we can receive comments from the North Pacific Council when they meet next week, because that is one of the principal people, groups the Commission has to work with, because they do have the authority for allocation within the U.S. zone. So this will be awkward because that meeting doesn't end until like December 16th, and this call was the 19th, and so I suggest that we recognize. I don't think Greg will have a chance to take a letter from the council that he receives on the 17th and incorporate it in the document. So I think we're just going to have that comment as a separate letter in hand as that meeting takes place on the 19th. So that if that's how we deal with that, we will, with Chris's information, we will, or taking that, we'll bring that to the council meeting. In terms of other things for the observer program, the bycatch report, one of the comments was to include as much information as we have, so perhaps it can be updated to include some of the information from the new observer program that was referred to by the one commenter. And I made a third note here, but I can't read it, so I'll ask if there's anything else from the commissioners that we need to decide here. David.
Not to unduly depress Greg here, but I just hope that this document will never be finalized, and that the Commission will always be attempting to refine, or to, how do I say this, keep making progress on this issue into the future, and build on what's in this draft, and maybe there'll be an updated draft at some point. You know, it'll be ongoing and a living document or something like that. So.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's better said than I said. We're going to keep learning things. So that was a nice summary. Anything else? Michael?
Sorry, just to give some precision. So I think we need to be clear that we're extending the comments on the existing documents to, what, the 18th of December? Is that a date to, i.e. in advance of the project team meeting, keeping in mind that not all information would necessarily be available or all comments available to the project team meeting, but at least as you described it, for example, from the Management Council, there would be a letter or a report that Chris could provide to the project team so they can take that into account. Then it doesn't give, given that that's 3 days or 6 days before Christmas, doesn't give much of a chance for Greg to, speaking about further depressing him, to turn that around into an updated version for the annual meeting, which is only 3 weeks later, I appreciate. But it's not clear to me that we're asking Greg to rewrite the document as a result of the commentary. It's to update with further information on it, and you may need to have an annex to the document which reflects the comments that have been made. But that's a discussion for the project team. And I think once the project team has that discussion, close off the comments on the 16th or 17th or 18th of December, have the project team meeting on the 19th, hopefully have Greg in a position where he can have something ready to be available to all who are going to be involved in the annual meeting and all who are interested in it by, let's say, the 10th of January, so that people have a few days to look at it before the discussion at the annual meeting takes place. So just want to be making sure everybody has a common understanding of that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So December 19th is a Thursday, so I suggest that we don't receive any comments after the 17th, which would be Tuesday. That would, Monday and Tuesday of the week following the council meeting, we could get whatever comes in and anything else that comes in. And I agree with you, we can't expect those to be, certainly for the 19th, to be worked into the document, and I think it is up to the project team to decide how to react to them. And most likely it'll just have to be an appendix, because I don't think there's time to turn it over. But we'll leave that to the project team to go forward with. Anything else? Thank you very much for tolerating that a little bit awkward step through all of that. Steve.
And one further comment from the web audience. Don Lane notes that the bycatch project team would benefit from stronger membership of industry, and also comments that the commentary about gear touch was not unanimous.
Yeah, I think Greg said it was almost unanimous, which I was going to check to see what that means, but that's all right. Thank you for that, Mr. Lane. All right, I think we should take a 15-minute break, come back at 10:30. We still have a number of items to go through this morning. Thank you very much. Let's come back into session here. We have the webinar going. We're at the agenda item to talk about an update on the performance review implementation. We've hit bits and pieces of that as we've gone along by listening to the Strategic Research Board. That's not it, Scientific Review Board. And Steve Keith's here to lead us through this. Steve.
Good morning, Commissioners. The next three topics are actually all bound up together, and you've heard bits and pieces of them throughout the day today and yesterday, as Jim just mentioned. I'm going to discuss the update on the performance review, which was in 2012, and we're also, the next topic is the rules of procedure and financial regulations, and then the third one is a review of best practices from RFMOs, that's regional fishery management organizations around the world. there are no slides for the first part of this discussing the performance review. In your binders is a report that you asked us to draft for you at your work meeting in September, which is an attempt to document what took place during the 2012 performance review and what the Commission has done with the recommendations from the performance review, as well as the Commission's intentions for the future. And I believe your intention was to, at some point, publish this for the public as a report to the stakeholders about what, how the performance review turned out, basically. So we drafted it for you and sent it to you a couple weeks ago. We've had some comment already via email, and so this is a point at which to comment and decide how to proceed forward. What I imagine happening is that we discuss it now. We continue to discuss via email electronically between now and the annual meeting, and perhaps you approve the report at the meeting as a report to the public. And this it is not available to the public yet. You have the draft now.
Michael.
This is the performance review, correct? I sent you, Steve, a few days ago a few comments from the Canadian side, and we wanted to make sure that those were reflected in the revised draft, which I assume we don't have yet. On the broader question of making sure there is a document available for the annual meeting, we absolutely support that, and would want to. I know the original intent was to have that available for this meeting, but because of some last-minute comments we wanted to make on a couple of elements, and they're not significant, as you know, but important nonetheless. We just want to make sure that those are indeed reflected in a revised draft, and that gets recirculated to the commissioners for approval as quickly as possible, so you have plenty of time to have it available to everyone for the annual meeting. That's my only comment.
Thank you. Michael, do you think that before we finalize this, it would be appropriate to have the public look at it in case they recall something that we'd promised that we didn't follow up on, or they had a different interpretation which we might be able to respond to, or do you think this is a commission document that we'll just finish and then provide to them?
I think it's the latter, frankly, that we've had lots of public comment on the various recommendations that were made, and we've had a lot of discussion about those, including in last year's cycle of meetings, and that now is the time to be able to indicate more clearly what the Commission intends to do with the 12 recommendations, some of which we've already said in the past we've implemented already. This doesn't mean that the public doesn't have an opportunity to comment further on decisions that we've taken or approaches that we'll take, and we can have as an ongoing item if the public wishes to want us to review an approach that we're taking with respect to any of the recommendations. Clearly we could do that. So I have no problem in that regard, but I do think it's important that we have the Commission indicate clearly by this annual meeting what our implementation strategy is.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from commissioners? I agree with you, so let's, Steve, if you can incorporate the comments from the Canadian side. If the U.S. side wants to take another brief look, get those to Steve very quickly, and then we'll have a draft at the annual meeting.
Very good. Thank you, sir. I'll note in response to what Commissioner Pearson just said that one of the recommendations that we're going to talk about later, and one of the things that is in the report, is a continuing process of evaluating our performance on a regular basis, and that this would essentially be the report of the very first one, the first step of a continuing process. Thank you. Then the second element of these three is the rules of procedure and financial regulations. And as we mentioned already, part of the performance review was
a recommendation to update our rules of procedure and our financial regulations. And at the September work meeting, we provided you drafts of rules of procedure, financial regulations, and a new document, the funds and investment policy for the Commission, as well as draft rules of procedure for the Conference Board and the Processor Advisory Group. And so for this discussion, I'll note that Annika Saltman, our intern who was here this summer, who helped us with this work, is here for the discussion, as well as Chuck Ashcroft is online for the Conference Board, and Peggy Parker is here in the room representing the PAG. And the point of today's discussion was to note for the public that you do have these drafts, and for discussion to take place now, direction from you to us regarding the Commission documents or to the advisory bodies regarding their documents, and for intended action at the annual meeting.
Thank you.
So let me just make a few notes about this. The three Commission documents that you have seen are the revision of our existing rules of procedure, which we've had since 1972, or 51, I guess, and a review of our revision of our financial regulations, and then this new document, the funds and investment policy, which is called for in the financial regulations. And the copies that you have in your binders and are available to you online include extensive notes about how the changes were made in the revision and which things were moved around and why they were moved around. Part of our review this summer with our intern was a review of similar documents at other similar organizations and how they do business. So this is part of our update with best practices of fishery management organizations around the world.
Thank you. So how should we step through this? The U.S. side has some comments. I'd like to have Jonathan Pollard come forward and review where we are on the review of these documents.
And we may wish to discuss these three Commission documents first and then the advisory bodies.
That's a good plan. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm Jonathan Pollard. I work for NOAA in the General Counsel's office. We have begun our review of all these documents, and we're still in that review, so we won't have anything definitive to say now, but we hope to complete our review well in advance of the annual meeting. And in that review, we may be reaching out to IPHC staff for clarification on some of the rules. We do have a preliminary comment on draft rule of procedure 2.3, which I believe deals with the filing of financial and other interests of the commissioners with the commission staff. Our sense at this time is that the qualifications of commissioners and their involvement in the fishery is really a domestic issue. On the U.S. side, we have statutory criteria for appointment of commissioners, and the federal government does a careful background review of potential appointees to satisfy itself that the commissioners that are appointed will be able to serve on the commission on behalf of the United States. So we view this really as an internal issue, but this is probably one of the issues we'll be reaching out to the staff for more clarification on. Thank you.
Steve?
Yes, thank you for that, John. I will note that is the only thing which is actually new in the rules of procedure, and it comes from best practice at other commissions, and we recognize that it might both be contentious and also might be unnecessary. I did want to say earlier, and I forgot to, that the rules of procedure and the financial regulations other than that, don't contain anything new. They are the revision is an attempt to codify and clarify existing process and procedures.
Thank you. Ralph.
Mr. Chairman, Jonathan, I guess I agree with you. I think a lot of non-government commissioners may have a very serious problem with providing, it's not that anybody has anything to hide, but providing this kind of information to the process.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph. Michael?
A couple of comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, to essentially echo Jonathan's initial point with respect to the review that we're undertaking of these various documents and the due diligence that we wish to complete in advance of the annual meeting, so that a considered direction by commissioners can be given at the annual meeting, as I know the commission staff is seeking. So, like the U.S. side, we are committed to doing that. Whether in fact we can make a final decision and give clear direction on all aspects by the annual meeting, we'll have to determine whether that's in fact doable. But I think our intentions would be to make best efforts to complete as much of it as possible, as per, and I'll remind us all that this was one of the recommendations of the review, the external review, performance review of the organization, as of course was the ROP updates or revisions as appropriate for the constituent bodies such as PAG and Conference Board. We'll hear about that presently. On the specific question that Jonathan has raised, I think we probably have the same, in fact, I know we have the same position as the United States in this regard. We have a domestic process. Dave keeps inviting me to get on his boat, but not to be an observer. I think it's in the sense of how that is traditionally understood, as opposed to just seeing what he actually does. So, but I don't have any intent to think that there is a requirement for the Commission and the Secretariat to have information on hand, as opposed to have the assurance from prospective domestic parties that the commissioners so appointed have in fact been vetted appropriately. I'm conscious of the fact that there are best practices, and I think this language in particular that was being commented on comes from, I think, the bylaws, the Pacific Salmon Commission, correct? Another similar bilateral commission, obviously, geographically, and it's as being bilateral as well. So, I mean, we can prepare to discuss that with our fellow commissioners who are on that commission. But I do think that our default approach, is that there's a domestic process which, in fact, addresses the question that is being raised by that issue, and that should suffice. But and there are questions of privacy and information and that kind of thing as well, which I think Ralph and others have raised. But I will commit to be more definitive and clear on that for the purposes of the annual meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Ralph?
Mr. Chairman, I would just add that over the years, a number of commissioners have often offered to recuse themselves on certain issues because they felt like they might have a conflict of interest. And legal counsel has always said that was not necessary. You're picked to be a commissioner, and everybody in the room probably has some kind of ties that maybe they should or shouldn't be recused. But anyway, I think, in fact, I think Jonathan's the one that first told me about not worrying about being recused.
Thank you. So, I think so relative to these three particular documents, we have some foreshadowing of the parties' position on the filing of financial rules. The rest of it is still under review. We're working with the State Department on some aspects. We hope to be able to have a definitive comments at the annual meeting, but some of this process is outside our immediate control, so as much as we can get done, we will. And I think that's all we have on these 3 documents.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reminded by Mike Larson of one further point with respect to that financial one, and the reason we put it in there is also has to do with U.S. tax law concerning not-for-profit organizations, and so that's why it's a point of discussion, but there may be another way of satisfying those requirements that we see coming down the road. Anyway, that discussion can continue in the coming weeks.
Thank you. And Ralph has one more point.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of comments for both the rules of procedure and the financial regulations, but rather than take the time up here, I'd be happy to sit with Steve, Mike, Bruce, or whatever, and if it's deemed that any changes should be made, it could be maybe highlighted in a different color for the annual meeting and something like that.
Thank you. I think we may have some editorial things as well, so we'll bring those up offline.
And we would certainly appreciate that assistance. Thank you. So next is the considering the documentation for the processes and procedures of the advisory bodies. The conference board has a draft rules of procedure which they presented to you and are prepared to discuss. And the processor advisory group also has a draft rules of procedure which incorporates their existing policy statement, and they're ready to discuss as well. I note that the other 3 advisory bodies, the Research Advisory Board, the Management Strategy Advisory Board, and the Scientific Review Board, do not have something that looks like rules of procedure yet, and so that's the question of what do they actually need, but something is probably necessary to define their structure and their processes so our stakeholders know what they do. And so I'll invite Chuck is on the line, and Peggy is here in order to answer any questions that you might have about their drafts at this point.
So shall we start with the conference board? Although, Peggy, feel free to comment on the conference board if you want to. But let's, shall we start with Chuck then online, I gather?
I'm actually on the telephone, thanks.
So if you can hear us, do you have any comments you'd like to make?
Yes, well, can everyone hear me now?
We're able to hear you, yes.
Okay, great, sorry. Well, I was basically waiting for comments on it if people have questions on what we've done in the terms of reference. Maybe I could just give an overview of, I guess, some of the hurdles. We tried to build it'll be the first terms of reference we've had in, I guess, 85 years or so that the conference board's been in existence. And as such, our basic attempt is to try and get something that everyone can agree with, and over time, it can be adapted and changed, there's no question, if we're failing in certain things. We tried to tighten up some of the aspects of the conference board there was uncertainties, and that's basically what we try to do. It's to try to be inclusive of all groups and stakeholders, and we think we've done the job. We have a committee struck that actually developed these, brought them to both by that committee discussion, then to take to the conference board winter. Yeah. And I guess everyone has to understand they're just draft only.
Okay, thank you, Chuck. So would you, looking through these, would you say this set of rules sort of documents the practices that have been in place for the last number of years, as opposed to finding anything dramatically different in the way to go forward?
Basically not. We haven't changed a lot. We've just tightened up and basically put in print how we want the meetings to go, how we want the accreditation process to go, the voting, et cetera, et cetera. And it's basically much the same that has been going on without actually having the terms built right into a term reference. didn't think huge changes would be possible because people are used to a certain way of dealing with this, and regardless, it's still going to require lots of cooperation, which we seem to basically get anyhow. So, on this first go-around, that seems to be what we've tried to do.
Thank you. So, Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question under item 4, nomination and accreditation. And it says that conference board members are halibut harvester organizations and associations. Aren't there some individual fishermen also that get accredited, or is this nitpicking and it doesn't matter?
Well, it hasn't seemed to be that way. For the most part, they have listed themselves as an organization.
Okay, so an individual fisherman from Timbuktu that is not part of an association, or I guess what you're saying is everybody is part of an association. Is that right?
And sometimes it can be their company name as well.
Okay. And then...
But it's worth discussing, and I'll make that notation.
Okay, and then the second thing is under point 3 there for nomination and accreditation, and point 4, it says that members seeking accreditation are encouraged to notify the IPHC, and then down below it says are encouraged to notify the IPHC. Who specifically at the IPHC? I mean, does it matter, or is this supposed to be the assistant director? Is it supposed to be... Anyway, those are my comments.
I'll continue on with this heading. That's a good question. Actually, the issue was originally it was to be notifying the chairs. Well, if we were dealing with all these people downloading to our email address, we could be listed with quite a few organizations wanting to list personally with us. So that we decided to, if we could work a system within IPHC where they can just go online, notify us of their wish to attend, and then go from there. And maybe even using the brand new conference board link that the IPHC has put in place, if we had a sort of an enrollment section that everyone knew to go, say, yes, I'm coming, this is our organization, then we had it. The accreditation process right now takes a lot of time on the Tuesday afternoon sessions that could be better used in another manner. We know it's going to be an evolving process. It's just, but you're right, who on IPHC, and it's always gone to IPHC, and they sort of filter it out to us in some way, and some comes straight to the chairs, so that's just trying to tidy it up, but it'll take more discussion, and with IPHC as well.
And thank you. I'll just note that we can certainly facilitate this in any way that the conference board wishes, to have us collect the information for them, and we can certainly do it via the new web page.
Yeah, I mean, even as a sort of like a real-time update, when you click on Find Your Organization, and it just sort of appears on the document as added, or like in some situations, or if it's a list that's updated every once in a while. Don't want it to be onerous for IPHC staff, but we should be able to develop something. We'll just have to try and work on it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Paul.
Yeah, hi Chuck, it's Paul Ryle here. I was wondering, as you said, Chuck, a good part of the meeting is taken up with regulating or reviewing membership. Were other methods considered to doing this in advance of the meeting, and what sort of rules are in place to determine who's accredited? And is there a list that's publicly available of who is actually a member? And is that posted onto the IPHE website, for example? Bruce is nodding his head.
Yes, Paul, a lot of your mic breaks up on telephone. I don't know if it's the same on webcast. I can just get bits and pieces, stops and goes. As far as a location on the website, IPHC has created a conference board link on the website, and in it is every meeting from 1985, I believe, forward, that era, and as well as our TOR as well. Every meeting has a list of attendees that attended that meeting as an organization. That's what we go by. And so then you can get an idea of who all attends. Our issue is we don't know who's going to attend for the next meeting. That's what takes the time. That's what we have to try and evolve sort of a evergreen document of some way of dealing with this aspect.
Thank you. Michael, you were looking oh, David, thank you.
Chuck, can you hear me?
Yes, Dave, I can hear you. Fine, thanks.
Thanks to you and your committee for putting this together. I just was looking under the section 6, meetings there, and just wanted to make sure that there was language in there that ensured that the conference board would get its reports to the commissioners in a timely fashion during the annual meeting. Actually says during the annual meeting in one of the sections there, and in section E4 it just says will be presented to the commission. I just wondered if there's any need to put language in there that prescribes that the commissioners will get this information, you know, on a certain day or at a certain time or prior to their last meeting or something, just a kind of a timeliness clause.
Could you hear that, Chuck?
Yes, I did, thanks. And I'm trying to think how our language doesn't basically indicate it just by, if you need it in printing, that's fine, but I think it basically says we'll have it, the document ready in draft form for certainly the presentations on Friday, and as you asked for the Thursday time, this last time for a session in the morning, we entered the document then. I think that's maybe taken as for granted, but we'll see if we can improve the language there.
Thank you.
And as far as the committee, I should mention that this committee was struck from both U.S. side and Canadian side, and there is full representation. My thanks to the committee. Really made it easier for the U.S. chair and I to.
Thanks. Michael.
Thanks, Chairman. Hi, Chuck. Nice to hear your voice. I have 3 comments which are more broad and in impact on the PAG process as well. And nice to see Peggy here representing PAG. One is related to the decision, the adoption decision at the annual meeting in this coming in January. And maybe it's a clarification we need to get from you, Bruce, with respect to who's making what decision here. The performance review recommendation number 1 that addressed this issue has indicated that there should be approval of these revised or updated rules of procedure for advisory bodies at the 2014 annual meeting. But approval by who? Is it a conference board internally approves its update and we simply endorse it? Or are we being actually asked to pass a motion to formally adopt it? So I'm sure there'll be an answer to that, but it's important to clarify the procedure. So that's one issue. The second one, and it relates to the relationship between the proposed commission rules of procedure and in particular rule number 10, which describes the advisory bodies, and conference board and PAG, or there's some detail in fact in relation to conference board and PAG. Now there's 2 comments I'd make there. One is I would welcome any views from members of the conference board and PAG with respect to the draft language on under Rule 10. So the extent to which they have or have not seen that language, I think we should make sure that they do. Secondly, there is at the beginning of Rule 10, and I'll quote it, the the following words. The Commission may establish or dissolve advisory bodies to assist its work as it deems necessary. The Executive Director shall make recommendations concerning advisory body structure and membership to the Commission. I think we need to distinguish between the role of the Executive Director in doing so for what I would call internal, in the sense of within, MSAB, for example, so it's not the word internal, but there's a distinction in my view between the SRB, the MSAB, those kinds of advisory bodies, and the what I would call more autonomous, shall we say, or independent advisory bodies that are reflected in Conference Board and PAG. I do not think, and I'm sure it was not the intent of the Commission staff to suggest that the Executive Director shall make decisions about the Conference Board and PAG membership. So that just language needs to be clear about what the distinction is in that regard. I think that's pretty simple. And thirdly, just it's coming back to my point on the performance review recommendations, and perhaps it's in relation to the initial point I made that we have the performance review text be clear about, because it's going to be a public document, about what is the decision-making process envisaged for this at the annual meeting. So that comes back to my first point, which Bruce will answer procedurally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Bruce, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Pearson. I think the intent was that the two advisory bodies would approve their internal, their draft rules of procedure and forward it to you for approval by the Commission. That's what was stated in the recommendations for the performance review. On the other matters, it certainly was not the intent of this draft rules of procedures that the Executive Director would recommend the membership, particularly for ones such as the CB and PAG, which are totally, as you say, Michael, sort of external to the Commission. The internal ones, we have made some recommendations to you for your approval in the advisory bodies that are internal to the staff process now.
And I can add that was written with the recent formation of the MSAB and SRB in mind, and certainly the language can be broadened.
Thank you. Chris, were you looking for attention? Yes. That's the wrong way to say it. Were you looking to be recognized? Yes. Please.
At the risk of asking an unexcellent question, when I look at the purpose of the board and the nomination and accreditation, it says members are halibut harvester organizations and associations, et cetera, et cetera. I guess I have two questions. One is, would that prevent the participation of an individual from participating? In other words, they have to be a member of some association. And I guess my second one is with regard to harvester organizations. Is that meant to refer to directed fishery users? I ask this question because it's been asked of me, and with the focus that we have right now on this halibut bycatch working group report and the importance of that issue and the presumption that the conference board will be making recommendations on that issue, does that preclude the participation of other user groups, whether it be trawl associations, users of the halibut resource as bycatch, or Pacific cod, longline, or pot fishermen, or is it strictly directed fishery, intended to be strictly directed fishery users?
Any thoughts on that? I would note that Rule 10 in the Commission document points out that the conference board could have other interested parties. And I'm not sure if that contemplates Pacific cod, pot fishermen as well. And it's the same for the PAG, so Peggy might be thinking about the answer when we get there as well. Chuck, are you still on? Are there any Commission thoughts on that? I actually don't have a position on it. I can see some utility, as Chris points out, if we're working it seems to me that much of our commission business has been around bycatch, and to have information from those groups that were looking, trying to impose new restrictions and rules, having information from them might be useful. Again, like I said, I don't have a position, but I think it's a really good question. David.
Well, I'd never thought about this, but I'm glad that Commissioner Oliver raised it, because upon just a little reflection, bycatch is the second biggest user of the halibut resource in the North Pacific, and I'm not sure just how they would participate in what the conference board usually does, which recommends directed fishery TACs by area. But Chuck seems to have dropped off the call right now, and there was a bit of a silence there, so I thought I'd better jump in. I wouldn't say we should rule it out. You know, it's a major user of the resource, and not just quite sure how those interests would fit into what the conference board has been doing these last decades, though. But
Chris.
Just to follow up, and I haven't been obviously involved in this commission process as much as many of y'all have, but does the conference board typically take up all the same agenda items that the commission does, or in other words, their discussions typically aren't strictly limited to the catch and apportionments, correct?
Bruce can probably.
Guys are back on here. Commissioner Oliver, that's the conference board and the PAG do cover almost everything that comes into the commission as well, from the assessments through the regulatory proposals and catch and proposals, and give those views, their views, to the commission.
Peggy.
Thank you, Jim. Make sure I'm close enough to the mic. I'm going to try and channel some of the CB members I've talked to in the past and be accurate on this. I think the requirement has been quota holders for membership, for voting membership, but there have been a lot of activity among other non-directed members of fisheries and sports fisheries in the conference board. I'll describe when we get to the PEG how we do that, but I think the purpose of having the activity be at the conference board is to get the full understanding from people who know what's going on in the non-directed fisheries and in the sports fisheries and in environmental issues. I mean, it's pretty open. But when it comes to voting, I think the requirement was you had to be a quota holder and be a member of a group.
Bruce.
Mr. Chairman, as pointed out by one of the speakers online, that during the public sessions of the conference board, the public has an opportunity to comment during the public sessions.
Any other thoughts? Michael.
Actually, Paul may comment further. We were just talking about the membership issue as well, because there are, for conference board, that is, what about the sport fishery? They've been participants in the conference board. They're not strictly speaking the way we define the word harvester as harvesters, but I'd be open to Chuck's view and others about whether or not there is any intent to exclude by the wording that is used in the, not intent, it may be inadvertent exclusion of individuals such as those who are participants in the fishery, First Nations as well, for example, who may or may not be involved in commercial activities, but would be harvesters as well. Do we want to make sure that there is no unintentional exclusion here?
Thank you. David?
I don't hear Chuck on here yet, so I just...
If anyone's getting me.
Okay.
Anything?
We're hearing you now, Chuck.
This has been quite an experience, and I've missed all the conversation because it's all broken up from your end. So I honestly don't know what the discussions have been.
Let's see. Mr. Boyes is going to make a comment right now, and maybe he's summarizing the questions we were hoping you would comment on. And if not, I'll try to hit some of those later on. But David, what was your comment going to be?
Chuck, can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine. I have been all along. All the others I haven't.
Okay. Commissioner Oliver suggested that there might be a rationale for including in the conference board other users of the halibut resource besides the participants that we have traditionally had there, commercial harvesters, sports harvesters, and First Nations, specifically sectors that harvest halibut as bycatch. And so I wanted to hear your comments on that and any procedures or process by which the conference board could think about that and possibly include it at some point in their membership.
Well, I suppose answering that, we would have to bring this particular draft to the conference board for approval or redrafting, and if we get into discussions on more entities to allow into the conference board, then I guess that could be part of the process. But likely then means there would not be a final approval or a good chance of it due to lack of time for the conference board discussing the rest of the stuff. But I couldn't say at this particular point, but yes, it can certainly be brought forward and be discussed.
Thank you, Chuck. And Chris Oliver has a further comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I brought this up. I wasn't, to clarify, necessarily suggesting that the conference board be expanded. I know enough about the IPHC meetings to know it's already a very large body, and so I wasn't necessarily suggesting, but I was. The language leaves me wondering if it's possible, and I've been asked if that's possible. In the case of the PAG, I didn't bring it up in the case of the PAG because, and I know that we're going to talk about that in a minute, I think it's a little bit different because that is about purchasing, processing, and selling halibut, and I think that's pretty clear who does and doesn't do that. But in the case of the conference board, if you're looking at user groups of the halibut resource, and define the word harvester. So I was simply looking for clarity on that, and as well as the issue of the individuals, whether regardless of what sector they may be from. In other words, could an individual participate without having to be a member of an association?
Well, in answering, I think the language was worked in as such to define harvesters so that it was designed as harvesters. Whether the language can be switched to have an individual harvester versus an organization, that can be discussed, and as all of this will be discussed. But I think the intent, certainly by the people there, representing the people they were involved with and trying to bring forth ideas, was to be kept to harvesters. So that will be all for discussions at the meeting.
Thank you, Chuck. And so I'm recalling that as we went through the performance review, some of the suggestions that were collected included new advisory boards for sports fishermen, new advisory boards for subsistence, and maybe yet another new advisory board. And an alternate suggestion was to expand the conference board to include these elements, maybe native Tribes and Nations Advisory Board as well. And so I've forgotten exactly where we ended on that. And like I said earlier, Chuck, I don't have a position on whether you ought to have sectors that use halibut as bycatch on your board or not, but I'm curious as to what if the conference board would think that would be useful to specifically allow it, particularly since, as David Boyes has pointed out, that's the second largest use of halibut is in bycatch. So that's interesting questions.
Well, it's interesting, yes. And as far as the other advisory boards, I guess if they feel the conference board does not involve them or does not represent them, then of course that they can make those decisions up. But we try to be inclusive of certainly First Nations, recreation, and of course industry as well. And of course, so happens I'm recreation. I think we're able to work through the process quite well in the conference board. As far as changing the draft, well, it won't be changed before it's being voted on. That's out now before the public and for the stakeholders. So that will be, can't do any more at this particular point until annual on that, I don't think, except take the suggestions in and offer them up as suggestions, try to get them all included. And since a lot of it's been broken up from your end, if could advise and put in writing for us some of the suggestions that come from yourselves, so that we're clear on what you wish us to look at, that would help too.
Thank you. So I think Steve has a clarification, and then Paul will have a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a clarification, you're recalling the performance review, and the actual recommendation in the performance review was to combine all of our advisory structure into one body, similar to the advisory bodies that the U.S. Fisheries Councils have, and that was not adopted by yourselves or any of your stakeholders. Nobody thought that was a good idea.
Thank you very much. Paul?
Yeah, hi. I was just looking at the last year's membership, and I was wondering about one in particular, Coastal Villages Regional Fund. So are they a harvester of some kind, or what do they do? And I don't know if you know the answer, Chuck, but then there's some others on there that seem broader than the definition that are used in 4A. So
yes, there's been some areas where I guess maybe some of the issues or the harvest aspect has been stretched, but maybe not. I'm not familiar with those. The Coastal Regional Fund, I believe, does harvest under CDQ, I believe, but I may be stepping out of bounds there. Those online that are from that area would be able to explain much more there. And or is Rob not on the call as well, or in attendance? Because he would be able to answer that better than I.
I believe you're alone on the phone, Chuck, but we do know the Coastal Village Regional Fund, what it is. Maybe Chris could tell us.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, they're one of the 6 community development quota groups. I believe they harvest CDQ halibut as well as perhaps directed IFQ halibut, and I'm not sure what their ownership of IFQ halibut is. They also are a majority, I believe now, a majority owner in one of the largest groundfish harvesting operations in the state.
Any more comments? So do we have a way forward? We're going to ask these questions of the conference board, whether they want to consider them or not. I didn't see any strong advice here. It's, for the conference board, we're interested in what their thoughts are.
Well, it sounds like there's a number of inputs and questions that the commissioners have for the conference board, and so as Chuck mentioned, if you can give those to them, or you can give them to me and I can give them to them, then they can consider them at the annual meeting. So as a point of process, it sounds like it may not be possible to approve the final version at this annual meeting if the conference board itself has not yet approved it, pending changes in response to your comments. Chuck, do you care to answer on that?
Yeah. Sorry, I would say that that's correct. If there's a lot of changes to occur, then we will probably have to go back to the committee, redraft if that's what the suggestion is by the members in the conference board, to look at it and add it and redraft it and get it approved later. And it's been probably more difficult since this is the first draft we've ever had, and it's a work in progress until we get it right.
Thank you, Chuck. Michael?
That's just to ask, I guess, Bruce, is there anybody on the webinar who's asking a question, or just want to make sure we don't miss anyone?
Mr. Chairman, I believe those questions have been passed on and answered.
Okay, thank you. Can we move to the PAG? Peggy?
Thank you, Jim. We have approved our draft ROP. It is similar to our mission statement that we had the benefit of actually looking at again a few years ago. So this process was familiar to us. So I've been listening, though, and very grateful. Thank you, Chuck, for going ahead of me, to the comments from the commissioners. And I agree that the language on when the principal report be provided the commissioners should be specified. And I think for us it would be an easy matter of just adding some language, which I could read to you now, something like this. To our membership, we have a membership of about between 25 and 35 companies every year. And we have them on a very familiar email distribution list. So, and they are aware that this is being discussed today. So I could shoot that out and get their responses back so that we could have a final ready to submit to you by the end of the annual meeting week. And if you'd allow me to, I'll just go ahead and read you my notes from what might answer this issue. It would be under item 6 on the second page of the PEG document. And the subheading is Reports, Minutes, and Other Meeting Materials. And the section that currently reads, completed reports or other documents prepared and discussed at the PAG meetings will be presented to the Commission and made available to the public through the PAG section on the IPHC website, would then be amended to read something like, completed reports or other documents prepared and discussed at PAG meetings will be presented to the Commission at a time to be determined by the Commission, currently on Thursday morning of the week-long IPHC annual meeting. So unless there's comments or improvements on that, I'll get that out to the PAG members and can get back to you. And otherwise, I'm happy to hear any further adjustments or changes that need to be made.
Rolf.
Mr. Chairman, Peggy, this is kind of an off-the-wall question, but in reading the PAG document here, it's very obvious that HANA and PAG are locked at the hip. And so my first question would be, how many companies belong to the PAG that don't belong to HANA, roughly?
On an average, every year there's probably 15 or 20% in terms of numbers.
Okay, and then my second question would be, heaven forbid, but let's just say HANA dissolved. How does that affect this document, since they're so locked at the hip, and you know, you are required to do the minutes and you're required to call the meeting to order? Is this a concern or not?
Thank you for asking that question, Commissioner Hord. I'm sure they'd have to hire a team of people to do what I do. No, seriously, if HANA were to dissolve, then we'd look to tying up the loose ends before that happened, and an important one would be to assign these duties to someone at the PAG. But, you know, the PAG really, despite that connection, there is a connection, but a historical tradition sort of, but the PAG operates as a group of individual processors, and we have a section in our meeting where HANA makes where we report what the recommendations to the PAG from HANA would be. But at that same section, other companies are reporting what their recommendations to the PAG would be. So it's the distinction is kept clear in the process.
Michael.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks, Peggy. I just want to be clear about the amendment that you proposed. I think you mentioned at a time to be determined by the Commission and then said, you know, Thursday morning. While it is Thursday morning and may forever be Thursday morning, it could happen at some point in the future when another date or time during the week is picked. So you may want to not include the word Thursday morning, just generally at the time of the annual meeting as determined by the Commission. So the same principle would apply to Conference Board, obviously. That's a minor point. Thank you for the effort, by the way, that you've put into producing these the ROPs. They're good.
Any further comments? I see none. Let's say we're through with this at this time. And thanks, Peggy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Then, as following our discussion, as we've talked about now, we may have a final from TAG to consider for approval at the annual meeting by the Commission and the Conference Board. It will depend on how many and the extent of changes that might be made in their draft. And so the way forward for Conference Board will be determined probably at the annual meeting. And then during the course of the coming meeting cycle, our suggestion is that we ask the other three advisory boards to consider how they might document their structure and process in order to make it public to the, or clear to the public what they do and how they assist you.
Thank you. Michael.
Sorry to take the mic again, Jim. I just wanted to, I don't think at least I'm not clear exactly on the decision-making approval at the annual meeting. So let's say the PAG is, as we seem to have discussed now, is ready to have it formally approved. So the PAG membership would formally approve it at the annual meeting, and are the commissioners asked to formally approve or just acknowledge the rules of procedure?
I think Rule 10 suggests that we would approve.
We have to formally approve them?
Right. Your own draft rules call for you to approve them.
Okay. So then that would be consistent with practice, or has there been a practice?
There hasn't been a practice,
right.
But it is consistent with practice elsewhere that you
should approve the rules of procedure of any advisory body.
Correct. Effectively, the Commission charters the advisory bodies it wishes to assist itself.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that. That was important. So we will do that at the annual meeting. I gather on the final morning, someone will make a motion to adopt it, and we'll see whether it can be passed or not. Thank you. Shall we talk about best rules, or best procedures?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the third topic is best practices from RFMOs. Again, that's Regional Fishery Management Organizations. And you'll recall from the summer, our graduate intern project not only helped us produce the draft rules of procedure financial regulations for the Commission, but studied the best practices question at length. And the reason that we had this graduate intern project this summer was because we felt that this was a gap in the 2012 performance review. In other words, it was chartered to compare the operation of the IPHC to best practices worldwide, and yet it really didn't do much in that regard. So we commissioned our intern this summer to look at that, and I'll invite her up here now. It's Anna Saltman to brief you on the report that she has prepared. You don't have the report. We're going to give it to you or post it for you today, effectively. And the idea is we're going to describe what the report is, because it's like 35 pages long, and what it means, and then for you to consider it between now and the annual meeting, and then direct the staff accordingly at the annual meeting. Let me get the slides here.
Hi, my name is Annika Saltman. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington, School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. I'm currently in my second year in that program. I'd like to thank the Commission, Dr. Lehman and Steve Keith, for the opportunity to be here today and present this work. This presentation, as was mentioned, is focused on a report that I wrote as part of the 2013 IPHC Public Administration Graduate Internship, and the full report will be given to you at some point for your consideration. So I thought I'd begin with a brief history of recent developments involving best practice in regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs. This will form the context for this project and set the stage for the rest of the presentation. In 2005, a conference on the governance of high seas fisheries in the UN Fish Agreement called for the mandates of RFMOs to be broadened and strengthened, as well as for the development of better ways to systematically review and assess RFMO performance. The 2006 High Seas Task Force echoed these calls from the UN and developed some brief guidance for RFMO assessment. They further proposed that a comprehensive model be developed for improved governance. This resulted in the formation of an independent panel hosted by Chatham House, the Royal Institute of London. The panel published a comprehensive model in 2007, which set out what they viewed as current best practice in the implementation of international fishery instruments. It is within this setting that many RFMOs began undergoing performance reviews, many of which utilize the various models of current best practices that had been developed. The IPHC, as you all know, underwent a performance review in 2012. However, the review did not produce comparisons between identified best practice, the IPHC, and other RFMOs. So this report addresses this gap. In order to make these comparisons, I developed a framework which takes into account the current best practice literature, but also has the luxury of being customized to evaluate only one commission, the IPHC. I identified the report of the Chatham House Independent Panel, or Lodge et al. 2007, as the most complete yet succinct checklist, and my decision to use it in the primary role for evaluating the IPHC can be summarized in 3 reasons. First, the report folds in a great deal of existing literature as well as knowledgeable personnel. Second, the report had a large amount of supplemental research done in conjunction to its preparation, which was utilized in the model. And finally, perhaps most importantly, this report is heavily cited in performance reviews, documents out of the UN and FAO, peer-reviewed literature, and has been used to develop performance review criteria for tuna RFMOs. The framework also includes recommendations from a report published in 2006, which has a similar thematic breakdown but differs slightly on what the authors suggest as best practice. Of note is that one of the lead authors of this paper was a member of the independent panel as well and co-author of the Lodge et al. Paper. So this is the resulting framework which evaluates the IPHC by best practice category. These listed categories are the elements that I identified from the literature as being pertinent to the IPHC. Each category is addressed in the report, and documentation of the Commission is used to evaluate whether or not each suggested measure within a category is present within the organization and structure of the IPHC. The report then gives recommendations for the Commission in each of these categories based on the discussion. The recommendations given in my report fall into 3 different groups. The first are areas in which the IPHC already performs well, fulfills best practice, and my report's recommendations involve the Commission continuing these current practices. A salient example would be the IPHC's incorporation of the precautionary approach. The literature gives the IPHC as an example of a standout organization that has firmly embraced the precautionary approach. Furthermore, the IPHC has not only instituted these measures and documentation, but has also given it as an example of effective implementation of the PA under single species management. A second, less involved example would be something as simple as publishing documents via the Commission's website in order to fulfill the best practice of having a readily and publicly accessible website. The second group consists of non-applicable best practice categories or individual recommendations within categories that are present in this framework that have been identified as not applicable to the IPHC. I did not include these elements in the evaluation. An example would be leaving out the special requirements of developing countries or dispute settlement practices, best practice categories when developing this framework in front of you. Individual recommendations that fall under the applicable categories but are themselves not applicable to the IPHC are discussed at the end of each section of the report. So an example of this would be the exclusion of any recommendations that are given in the literature for new RFMOs. The third and final group is the focus of further discussion. These are recommendations for consideration and work by the Commission. So several of my report's recommendations involve the continuation of work that is already undertaken and in progress here at the IPHC. The first recommendation involves the approval and formal adoption of updated basic texts, including the Commission's rules of procedure and financial regulations. Recommendations to update both documents, as you all know, were developed to incorporate current best practices and make them more complete and useful. These recommendations are reflective of the best practice literature and the documentation of other similar organizations. Adoption of these recommendations will allow the IPHC to fulfill best practice within several categories in the above framework, including institutional practices, decision-making practices, and transparency. Best practice literature also states that the standard of transparency in decision-making processes and other activities should extend not only to the Commission, but also to the committees and advisory bodies of an RFMO. So this report recommends that all advisory bodies of the IPHC have formally adopted rules of procedure or other documentation of their functions and processes that are made available to the public in order to fulfill this best practice. Second, the IPHC enjoys specified privileges and immunities under U.S. law, but does not currently have similar privileges and immunities under Canadian law. This discrepancy could potentially affect the IPHC's ability to hire employees according to merit. The Commission has petitioned the Canadian government, and positive action on this petition will solidify the IPHC's ability to adhere to this institutional best practice. And finally, the newly adopted structure of the 2013 annual meeting is much more in line with recommended best practices regarding transparency, as almost all sessions are open to the public. However, there are still closed sessions built into the structure to allow for discussion of sensitive financial and personnel issues. These may also contain some free debate and discussion of other issues without documentation. My report recommends that the Commission is careful to make detailed explanations of the process and evolution by which each decision was reached apparent to the public. Other recommendations in my report are potential new initiatives that can help the IPHC fulfill additional best practices. An entire best practice category within the framework is attributed to the performance review and evaluation of the IPHC. The literature recognizes the need for an initial performance review, but is also adamant that there exists a provision for regular performance assessment within each RFMO. Implementation of a regular review cycle, complete with documentation to this effect, clear guidelines or expectations for these reviews, and a process by which recommendations are considered and/or implemented would fulfill best practice stipulations. Second, my report recognizes that the majority of the responsibility for implementing the ecosystem approach falls on the two contracting parties, as the IPHC's mandate only extends to the single species management of the Pacific halibut. However, best practice literature is eager to have RFMOs explicitly reference the concept of EBM within texts. This has been accomplished in other older RFMOs through adoption of an amendment to the convention or by formal resolution. My report gives several examples of each of these. And my report recommends that the IPHC consider adopting language as it relates to the mandate and operations of the Commission. My report evaluates only whether or not certain measures are present in the organization and structure of the IPHC. It does not measure how effective the IPHC is in the successful execution of the mandate. So two opportunities for further work are discussed within the report, both of which involve measuring the IPHC's effectiveness. First, an explicit evaluation of the IPHC performance relative to treaty charter should be made. This could be accomplished either within a subsequent performance review or as a separate project. The second is the development of a standard framework that can be used to measure performance by quantifying the operations of this commission. A benchmarking framework could assist the IPHC in structuring a regular performance review cycle. To date, a benchmarking framework that has been published is comprehensive and is applicable to an international commission has not yet been developed. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Annika. Good presentation. Must be good graduate students. I didn't hear you stumble or say even once, so that's good.
I think I said it maybe twice.
Yeah. Ralph, let's start with you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Annika, thank you. Very good report.
Thank you.
Kind of off the subject, but could you remind me, are IFCs and RFMOs the same thing? International Fish Commission and Regional Fish Management Organizations?
Mr. Chairman, perhaps I could add that. IFC is the shorthand abbreviation the Department of State uses when it's doing its appropriations framework. So there are something like 17 IFCs within their account. So IFCs in general is not a widely used term, but RFMOs is.
So does that mean the State Department has 17 RFMOs?
Well, they're not all of them are RFMOs because not all of them have management responsibility.
And of course, North Pacific Fishery Management Council is an RFMO, but it does no international connection. So, no. Paul, please.
Thanks very much for the report, Annika. I had a question or clarification, I guess, on development of a benchmark framework for best practices. Maybe just repeat what you said. I thought I heard you say one had not been developed.
There are several that have developed parts, but there's not one that I've been able to find that's comprehensive, that's applicable to an international commission. So there has been work done in Australia, and that was the benchmarking framework that was developed for fisheries governance, but it was just for a domestic fishery within Australia. And there has been some PhD work that has developed benchmarking frameworks for the conservation and management section, but not really the institutional practices.
So you're saying more work required?
Yes.
And on the development and implementation of a regular external review process, what sort of practices have people followed as far as a time frame?
Well, the IPHC could be a front runner in implementing such a regular review cycle. The literature does recognize that it's a lengthy process, and not only is it time consuming, it's also can be costly. So I think the most important thing that they want RFMOs to take a look at is that there is some capacity for regular review that's within the documentation.
Yeah, I might add to that no one has had a second review yet, so there's no established interval, but the idea being that you do have some sort of regular process of performance review that could involve both internal review as well as external review.
Chris.
Thanks, Annika. Nice job. The reference to the ecosystem-based management approach and I guess some explicit adoption of that paradigm, does your report have any specific suggestions or language for how to implement that recommendation? We struggle a lot with how you actually define ecosystem-based management, so I was curious if there were any specific suggestions or recommendations with regard to how the Commission might do that.
The best practice literature actually has a hard time itself defining ecosystem-based management, and that's something that is discussed in my report. I think it really depends how the Commission wants to proceed on this issue, whether or not an amendment to the Convention is something that you feel is appropriate, or if you think that just a smaller document such as a resolution, something that mentions the ecosystem-based approach within official documentation of this Commission.
Michael?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Annika. A few comments, some of which may be addressed by the report itself, but it would be helpful. I think it's really a comment to the Commission Secretary as a whole, and it's not unique to this document that we don't see enough in advance to be able to comment more than what we just see on a screen. I appreciate it's not the first time we've had a discussion on this issue, but I do think it's important that commissioners be given an opportunity to see more documentation in advance or have it available, and maybe it was and I missed it, I don't know, so correct me if I'm wrong. But we're busy people, and we don't necessarily have the time, even if the document's being made available to us on the website, that we actually saw it or looked at it. Maybe we need to be hit on the head and being told that it's there or something. That's an editorial comment on some aspects of what you said, and I'd like to go back to slide 4 if we can for a minute.
Slide 4, please.
Can we go back to slide 4? So first, I think there's something that we need to think about in respect to the precautionary approach and ecosystem-based management. This relates to a couple of broader comments. There is something we might call RFMO best practices here, but there's also domestic best practice. And I think in particular in the context of IPHC, we should be looking at, not just in the context of precautionary or ecosystem-based management, how our respective American and Canadian domestic fisheries management practices define those terms and utilize those concepts. Because certainly on the Canadian side we do, and we have in fact done a lot of work in the last few years on defining what that means with respect to how that implicates actual fish management. So I think it's important that the IPHC should take into account not just, and this is a broader point, not just RFMO best practices, but in fact the respective Canadian and American best practices that may be relevant to the work of the IPHC. Now, I'm not suggesting you haven't done that, but I think it's part of an analysis that this report is undertaking or completing, that some reference to that, consideration to that be made as well. Also, and I know that this is in the case of a couple of other RFMOs that went through a performance review and where convention amendments have been or continue to be considered. ICAT is a good example where the whole concept of ecosystem-based management and precautionary approach is currently not in the convention text. And there are some proposals that in fact maybe we should introduce it into convention text, and the United States actually promotes that idea. Other points of view that saying when you open a convention, you open a can of worms and all kinds of other issues get put on the table. But I'm not, and I guess the question I have is whether in the IPHC convention, whether we have an explicit definition, my guess would be no, to what we mean by precautionary approach or ecosystem-based management, or that in fact we even endorse those concepts. So it may be that for the future work of the Commission, and knowing that we have a slightly, unlike ICAT, which is 47 members, we only have 2, and we have perhaps more opportunity to contain any changes that may be made if we wish to make changes to the Convention. This would be something that I would recommend we might want to consider. Thirdly, I think there is something to be learned about what I would call best practices developed in this organization that can be instructive to others, RFMOs, as opposed to just the other way around. So importing best practices as we might see them that you've articulated, I think is all well and good, but I think it's also valuable that we should consider whether we have best practices that have been developed in this organization or are continuing to develop that are worth telling a story about to instruct other processes. And I'm thinking the most recent and I think best example is how we're trying to evolve the stock assessment process, right? And not only the work going into the stock assessment, but the peer review aspects of that, the decision table approach that we're taking. There is a significant debate, and in fact this organization is significantly ahead in my view than many other so-called RFMOs on how to ensure that the science management decision-making nexus is improved and made as effective as possible. I think that we are demonstrating through the IPHC's practices here that we are seeking to try to improve that through those elements, and that I think the report should, I'm not saying necessarily this is a blow your own horn type of exercise, but I think the report should have some indication of where we we can note that there are things that we do in this organization that indeed themselves represent a best practice or an evolving best practice, which would be worthy of note to instructive for others. So just a couple of thoughts for you to consider.
Thank you, Michael. Any other commissioner comments, thoughts? Any response, Annika? Or
thank you for the comments. With respect to your last point, actually the report does note places in the literature that actually mention IPHC as an exemplar of best practice. And with respect to the stock assessment, I believe our stock assessment team is going to go to a conference and talk about our decision tables. And so there's an example of that where we are actually doing that. And to your first point, the report was only finished in the last week, and so the point of today's discussion was simply to introduce you to it and not expect you to have read it or know much about it. It was an introduction only. So my apologies if your impression was that any more than that.
Thank you. Is anyone online with comments? Bruce?
No, Mr. Chairman, there's one comment that we're dealing with the effect of ecosystem-based management. It goes to Commissioner Pearson's comment about whether or not the Commission has a formal definition of either the precautionary approach or EBM, and the answer is no, we don't have those formal definitions.
Thank you. Does anyone in the room wish to make a comment? I see none, so we will have this report distributed to us soon. Thank you very much. Appreciate the report. Can we move directly to the action item list, Bruce? These are the action items from the last annual meeting and from the Commissioners' work meeting in September.
Correct, Mr. Chairman. Did you want me to go through these individually or just simply highlight items that
Let me check the Commissioners' desires. I'm thinking the highlights, any changes to process, any changes in expectations for sure.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Probably the two major ones that were on the action list from last year was the formation of the Management Strategy Advisory Board and the Scientific Review Board. Both of those were accomplished, and I think those have provided excellent advice to the staff and to the process of the management strategy evaluation. The terms of reference and rules of procedure for both the CB and the PAG also were ones that were implemented. We just finished that discussion with those earlier this morning. So that was another major initiative in terms of staff developed some draft guidelines for those folks that they've then reviewed and made those presentations to you this morning. The financial rules is another thing we'll be discussing in our F&A session this afternoon. You have been provided with those as well as the new investment return policy. We did deal with a number of items associated with management in terms of submissions we'd received from either one of the boards or the individuals in terms of proposals regarding charters and harvest tickets and so forth. Those were all achieved. The Commission did instruct us to put some tasks before the SRB. Those were done, so there were two meetings. We're looking at the apportionment process as well as looking at data. I do want to update a little bit on the assessment review. We did have quite a bit of discussion with the SRB about the potential for having review of the assessment of in-season results. And the approach that the SRB has said is the most feasible for us, and the staff concurs with this, is that we will have a fall meeting much the same time as we had it this year in terms of October, which will be looking at the structural aspects of the assessment for that year, indicating if there are some immediate fixes that are needed, if there are some more substantive things, they will be put forward into the next cycle. In terms of looking at the results from a current year's assessment, that is also something that we felt was important, but because of the compression of the process of producing that assessment, as you well know, it happens in a breakneck pace and is sort of presented to you as soon as we have it out, and that's usually right next to the meeting. So the SRB did participate in our pre-meeting briefing, we will have a subsequent teleconference with the SRB in December later this month for they can bring forward any comments on this year's current assessments that we can then incorporate in our thinking and our presentations to you at the annual meeting, Mr. Chairman. We did institute, in conjunction with the Alaska Marine Conservation Council, some outreach work on improving discard mortality for both commercial and recreational fisheries, and trying to provide an education package in conjunction with this group. And I think those are the highlights, Mr. Chairman, from the annual meeting thing. For our work meeting in September, there were another series of recommendations. I separated these into things associated with science advisory bodies and performance reviews. The performance review in particular, we've just been through both the report that we've drafted for you for consideration, as well as the extension of that, which is Annika's recent presentation to you. We have reported to you the impacts of survey expansion in Area 2A. That was in the decision table yesterday, not the decision table, pardon me, the apportionment tables that presented to you yesterday afternoon. We were looking at, we have linked the annual research plan more directly to elements of the 5-year research plan. Greg presented that to you yesterday. We have had the chairs of the Conference Board and the PAG attend our meetings so that you can comment on those ROPs. The MSAB process is underway, and you did have an extensive discussion this morning about the Halibut Bycatch Work Group and its current process and where it will be going as a result of your reviews and the annual meeting discussions. We did have discussions with the MSAB and the SRB in terms of finding an appropriate balance between openness and the legitimate needs for in-camera discussions, and we have worked our way into those processes. The MSAB second meeting was fully webcast. The SRB meeting is recorded, and the meeting recordings are put on our website. In terms of ROPs, that process is underway, and the RFMA best practices, the next item on there, is also underway. And the remaining items, Mr. Chairman, are concerning the interim meeting arrangements, which we have been through, and then the annual meeting arrangements, which is also on our list for today.
Thank you. Let me ask about number 12 on that, which is hiring expertise to package communications. Where is that going?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, we've had quite a bit of discussion about this. I know Commissioner Pearson has had a lot of concerns about this in the past. The approach that we're recommending on this is that we will be appointing Steve Keith as our primary communications person, that we also will be having him access additional training in communications and try to deal with this in this fashion, as well as having feedback from yourselves.
Thank you. Any other comments from any commissioners? Michael?
Something that, just to flag that I want to continue this conversation, an aspect of a conversation in camera under the FNA agenda. And I'm trying to balance two things here. One, the importance of transparency in these action lists, and I think we've made our commitment, and it's reflected today in having this list provided and presented and available to not just ourselves but to others. And that's important. I also think, though, that in the development of these lists and the implementation of these lists or reviews of the implementation of the various action items, that we think carefully about what I would call feasibility. I mean, I think the Commission sometimes makes decisions about taking actions on things which subsequently are not possible to take action on. Sometimes that's just an honest decision and mistake or whatever it might be called. But I think in the context of creating public expectation around implementation of decisions that the Commission makes, and the extent to which this action item list reflects that, I wouldn't want to have something which is in what I would call indefinitely and underway, or to be completed, or in some cases where you say no further progress at this time. So it opens a lot of questions about why and so on. I think we need to be practical and realistic about which of the action items that are the responsibility of the Commission that we make decisions on, and be able to communicate those effectively, the implementation of those effectively to our broader community, so that we are not looking like we've just developed a whole laundry list of things of what might be nice to do or could do, etc., and then we end up not being able to do them. And so it's really a comment, Mr. Chairman, about thinking through more strategically what should be an action item list and how we would provide information in respect to the prosecution or implementation of that list. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it is good to let the public know exactly what we think we can do. So that's a good summary. Any other comments? Yes, on any of the. Chris.
Oh, this is Errol.
I have a question, Mr. Chairman, on one specific issue that frankly in the scheme of everything is probably pretty minor, but I've had a number of people ask me about this for years, thinking it was a council jurisdiction issue, and that's number 21. It says continue working with proponents to find feasible means to allow retention of recreational caught and processed halibut for long duration charters or liverboards. And it's been various things have been suggested, whether it's a poundage limit, for example, that might make the enforcement of that actually viable. Is that a dead end, really, Dr. Lehman, or is there any possibility of further looking at options for this?
Thank you, Commissioner Oliver. I think this is one that has been on our table now for a number of years. I think there has been if you will, a sort of a legitimate concern about people on liveaboards or long-term charters, how they can accommodate a very restrictive daily bag limit and still take advantage of a longer-term duration stay or liveaboard in this thing. We worked with both proponents of it. Mr. Olson, who was giving you testimony earlier, was one of the folks who we've worked with on this, and I think the primary issue coming out of this is that when we have these discussions, we also involve NOAA Office of Law Enforcement and Alaska State Troopers in this, and the sort of long and short of it is that the enforcement folks don't seem to see a reasonable way that this can be accomplished and accommodate both the goals of enforcement and monitoring in the process. So without sort of trying to make it a dead issue, we just have not been able to make any progress in here that's been able to satisfy all the proponents.
Chris, follow up.
Just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman, because the one thing that in my discussions with a number of folks that keeps coming up is what about a simple poundage limit? Has that been something that was discussed with enforcement, or is that they have issues with that approach as well?
Yes, that was discussed, Mr. Oliver. Yeah.
I think that oftentimes we point, maybe there will be some technology in the future that we can't anticipate right now that might let us get around that. I don't know what that technology is, or we could bring it up, but thank you. Ralph.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Bruce, remind me on this issue, where did we go with if they take an observer and they pay for the observer? Was that another dead end someplace, or?
Mr. Chairman, maybe I ask Heather Gilroy to come up and talk about this because she's been involved in those discussions.
I think that was one idea that we did discuss that was suggested, but there isn't an infrastructure there to manage it. Enforcement said, well, who's going to get the information? They also discussed cameras, put cameras on these boats, and not the liveaboards, but the Trident vessel that was having people come out, and they even said they would pay for the cameras, but there's not the infrastructure at NIMS or NOAA to follow through with that.
Any further comments on the action lists? Online, Steve? In the room? I see none. Bruce, lead us through the annual meeting preps.
I'm going to kick that run right over to Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I'm going to put up the draft of the annual meeting agenda that we have developed. And the point of this discussion today was at the work meeting, you looked at the draft agenda as it was, which is essentially a repeat of the last annual meeting, the annual meeting we had last January in Victoria. And the question that was discussed was whether the schedule for the week could be rearranged to promote less conflict between the advisory body's sessions and the Commission's own sessions. And you indicated a desire to hear from the advisory bodies about the annual meeting schedule. And so, again, Chuck is online. If he is not able to, his telephone was in and out. If he's not able to contribute, he's also sent to me electronically his comments. And again, Peggy is here from PAG. So I'll invite them to speak and provide you their input. So the question, the reason this agenda item is here today is to talk about the sequence of sessions in the annual meeting and whether it can be improved or modified to allow less overlap between the Commission sessions and those of the other bodies, thereby allowing everybody to see everybody's meetings.
So shall we take that from Peggy right now?
Thank you, Jim. Well, Hannah is very interested in hearing what the commissioners have to say, and the PAG is very interested in that. I don't know how much the commissioners are interested in hearing what PAG has to say, so our solution has been kind of one directional, and that is a little bit of a cudgel, but I can't really, we've talked about this, can't think of anything more sophisticated, is to have appointees or volunteers monitoring the commissioners' discussions while the PAG is in session. These folks will come back, tell us what's going on in that room. We will bring them up to date on what's been happening with the PAG while they've been away and kind of go forward in that way this year.
Any questions about that? I don't see why the commissioners would object to that or find any problem with it. If that's, so thank you. And is Chuck, are you online? I don't hear that, Steve, so can you relate to us what his point was or his interest was?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, let me read through his comments here. Chuck notes that commissioners and staff need to be sensitive to discussing issues with public that are also being discussed in the stakeholder advisory boards. As part of this, IPHC staff and commissioners should consider not fielding questions that could be interpreted to be in conflict with PAG and conference board discussions. I have to point out there are adequate open public sessions Monday afternoon, Tuesday morning, Thursday morning, as well as Friday morning. Additionally, there are the catch limit and regulatory comments online in advance that are part of this consultative process. Conference Board also allows for public observation of its proceedings with an opportunity to comment at the end of the Wednesday sessions. And then he has further comments here. Precedent set in Canada, which possibly should be adopted by IPHC. Commissioners should refer stakeholders and other outside parties who offer unsolicited recommendations and advice outside of the established stakeholder processes to the appropriate advisory body contacts, PAG or CB. Commissioners should also inform the advisory bodies of any solicited advice it receives.
Any solicited advice?
Well, I think Chuck means unsolicited advice there, and I suspect that what he's talking about is members of the public or stakeholders trying to do an end around to the advisory bodies basically directly to the commissioners.
If I can break in here, if anyone can hear me.
We have you now, Chuck. Thanks. Go ahead.
Well, I'm in and out, I guess. There is unsolicited recommendations, and there's solicited advice that you have asked someone to advise on. That solicited advice, the PAG and CB should also receive or be informed that it has taken place. It just stops these end arounds that could occur in the future on some sensitive issues.
Thank you. I have that. So does the conference board or the PAG have some thoughts on stakeholders or user people who are not allowed to be conference board or PAG members, and whether or not the commissioners can solicit or receive advice from them?
Well, yes, and then at least inform the conference board and PAG that advice has been received.
Thank you. I understand. Anything else?
All in the process.
Sure.
Yes, I agree. I'm really not sure who these folks are that are going directly to you, but I think it would be really helpful to know that they have been and what their concerns are.
Any commissioner thoughts? Either on the solutions from the PAG and the conference board on how they will track our meetings, or on any other aspect of the agenda? Paul?
No, it sounds reasonable to me what was proposed, but and you probably already considered this, but is there anything else that could be done on the agenda that would?
Ralph?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I guess I lost my train of thought here. I'll come back.
Thank you. Michael?
I'm not sure you even have a train of thought, so not you, Ralph. I thought that we had talked before about trying to rejig some of the timing of the public sessions so that they were a little bit more overlapped rather than a directly contradictory, i.e. the same time as the various PAG and conference board meetings. And I'll give you an example where, because I don't see it yet reflected in the current draft of the annual meeting. So you look at Wednesday, for example, Wednesday afternoon, and we have a 1 to 2:30 p.m. administrative session that talks about the research program, the bycatch issue, unfinished business, all these things which would be of interest, I think, to both PAG and conference board members. And yet we have conference board session, PAG sessions happening exactly at the same time. So why not be able to say we're going to have a reduced lunch period. We have at 11:30 to 1 break there. You maybe have a 12:30 start time. It goes till 2 instead of 2:30, and then you have the conference board not start and PAG not start till 2, so that they can all participate in that section. You can't resolve this for the whole week. I appreciate that. You don't have that flexibility, but there are some mechanisms whereby we could try to not have direct conflicts so that there is opportunities for PAG and conference board members to participate or participate, frankly, in the public sessions. And you can construct issues that will be during that time period where we know they would have a particular interest. So they may be less interested, for example, as a group in some of the agency reports on specific regulatory areas, and so where there's the issue of having PAG meetings or conference board meetings at the same time as our own would be fine, and there are other ones, such as the ones I just mentioned, where that overlap or that opportunity, because we slightly rejig the time frame, may be a mechanism to address some of the issues and interests that have been expressed here. So that's something to consider. You asked, Mr. Chairman, were there any other comments on the agenda? My only one was on the Friday. We have it suggested that the final public session would only be from 9 to 11. I think our practice last year, we started the annual meeting, was to extend that by an hour in order to ensure that there was, and I think in fact that was demonstrated as worthwhile, because there were a number of public comments that people wanted to make after we made decisions, which we should be accommodating in the time frame of the program. And I think we did that by extending it to noon at that time. So I can be corrected by others, but I believe that would be a relatively simple thing to do. Thank you.
Let me clarify. Did you say that would be after we make decisions and then take the comment?
Well, remind us what we did. I thought we had decisions and then we had public comment, or maybe we did both. Had comment, then decisions, then further comment.
When you say remind us, you should look over that way.
I know. I meant to do that. Remind us, Bruce.
we had more time built into the schedule on Friday because you had asked the advisory bodies to consider the performance review reports and to make suggestions to you, which they would only be able to do on Friday morning. So that time, the Friday session was extended in 2013, and I think the time that we've written in this draft is the same amount of time as we used last time. But it can go till noon. We actually had in the schedule this past annual meeting an additional public session that ran like 11 to 12:30 or something like that, if necessary, and we did not use it.
So let's see. First, Chris.
So we have the room all morning. If we want to go longer or restructure the Friday schedule, we can certainly do that.
So ask that.
Okay, sorry, Mr. Chairman. The one thing that I noticed on the agenda Wednesday, the 15th, Administrative Session 3, is scheduled from 1 to 2:30 with, I believe, a closed session starting at 2:30. And when I look at the agenda, which includes the research program as well as the bycatch working group, strikes me that an hour and a half might be tight to get through those agenda items. And I don't know if there's a possibility of starting the finance or the closed session a little later. It just jumped out at me that was a pretty tight window.
Thank you, Chris. And so the sidebar question was, do we take public comments in our sessions? And we don't, I guess, because we take those in the general public session, and we don't have public opportunities for the public to speak to us in these administrative sessions. Is that correct? We've done that now? Public comments in each one. Okay, thank you very much. Please.
In that event, and I meant to ask that because I saw it on there and I couldn't remember how that worked, but in that event, that just leads me to believe that's an even tighter window we're looking at there.
Very good comment. Ralph.
Mr. Chairman, my train came back. What's not been working for the conference board and the PAG, and why has this been brought up at this time? I mean, is
this a question of ourselves here, or am I being heard again?
Yes, you are, Chuck. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. It's just very, very broken up from your end, and I guess it's just difficulty we're working through here. This only came up just now, this last year, during when the system was opened up for the public to all your discussions on administrative sessions. And we had, there was people that would leave the conference board and probably maybe even PAG, I'm not sure, and would go sit in and see what's going on. Maybe had input, maybe didn't. We have no idea or no way of knowing. But it was brought up during the conference board that this could be a possibility that down the line more would occur, and the stakeholder body and the meetings would be compromised as far as would be compromised. So it was brought up. We know there's likely not much chance the agendas can be changed around, or else the commissioners will be working all night instead of during the day. But that's why the suggestion on maybe how to handle input and questions, such that the stakeholder bodies were at least kept informed, nothing else. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up. Chris, you might mention to everybody how the SSC and the AP starts earlier with the idea to try to allow everybody to sit in on those discussions that wants to.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I comment we do stagger the meeting and we start our SSC. Usually each agenda item will go to our SSC first, then to our advisory panel, then to the council, so there's sort of a sequencing there, and then we have to juggle the agenda to make sure that that sequencing works. But what it doesn't allow, and I think what the conference board seems to be suggesting, it doesn't allow the advisory panel or the SSC to necessarily be present during the council discussions, because when the council is discussing their particular recommendation, they're across the hall working on the next agenda item. So it still doesn't allow what I think the conference board and the PAG were getting at.
Steve.
in our particular case as well, the conference board and PAG depend on hearing the initial presentations at the annual meeting, so it wouldn't be, my opinion, would not be feasible for them to start before the commissioners and for the Halibut Commission. The other thing I wanted to point out, that Chuck sent another note that he wanted to make sure that the Commission understood we didn't. He thought he heard someone suggesting that the conference board session be shortened, and he said that would be a problem for them because it's hard for them to complete their business in their allotted time. And further to what Chuck said earlier is that the reason that this question has become somewhat more salient is that this past annual meeting was the first time that all the admin sessions were open to the public, and so it became more obvious that there was a conflict between the advisory bodies and the commission sessions.
Bruce?
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if we might ask for Peggy's commentary on this too, because I think one of the issues that Chuck identified is the concern about end runs around the advisory process and people going directly to the commission at an admin session. And so the idea of having someone from those advisory bodies sitting in our sessions and reporting back to those bodies is appropriate, or as Chuck pointed out, for the commission to make the advisory bodies aware of anything they had received in there. But I'd like to ask Peggy to talk on that too.
Thank you, Bruce. One of the comments we keep hearing from the PEG is what's really going on in those rooms. And so that's part of the reason why we have hallway discussions with the commissioners or with people from the conference board who have been in there. The PEG has not officially sent anyone in, but I'm sure some of our members have just wandered in and listened to bits and pieces. Over the course of that week, we hear certain things from certain people about what the commissioners are thinking, and 10 minutes later we'll hear something that's pretty opposite of that, and we're confused. So to put some sort of a infrastructure on this by actually naming or having some volunteers be responsible for reporting back to us frequently as to what's going on will help us do our job. I know it's a little bit of a back and forth to advise the commissioners. Steve Keith did a great job, I thought, last year in providing the new decision tables every time they were asked for by the commissioners, and Ian would scramble to get them, and then Steve would distribute it to the advisory bodies. And that really helped. You know, we're sometimes a little bit lost in the fog about what, you know, very, very detailed numbers, and if the commissioners are going a completely different direction, it helps us understand that. And one other comment, I'm sorry if I could, about Commissioner Pearson's comment on Wednesday. Wednesday is probably the busiest day for the conference board and the PEG because we're really struggling to get our report finalized. For the conference board, they sometimes don't get that report finalized until 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock that night. And unfortunately, the PEG has me as their secretary, and we have a kind of a big reception that night that I'm always kind of late for, so it just is logistically a little difficult.
Thank you. So Steve, did you have a comment?
Well, first, just to give credit where credit is due, is that Ian produced the decision tables at close intervals during the last annual meeting with Steve Martell. Thank you. And the other thing I wanted to note, Mike Larson reminded me, is that we now also webcast the administrative sessions, which we didn't do before, and we'll have a live Twitter feed during this coming annual meeting, and so there is opportunity for others to know what topics at least are being discussed in the commission sessions while they're taking place.
Thank you. So I have failed to find any firm recommendations to make to Bruce or Steve on changing the schedule. I think we've recognized some difficulties here, but Peggy and Chuck have proposed sort of solutions around some of it, but certainly not all of it. But maybe I've missed something. Is there any firm recommendation on changing the timeline? Chris Oliver also noted a potential tight window that's identified for some big topics. Michael.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of thoughts here. First of all, I don't necessarily think that we are wedded to, in the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or particularly Tuesday, Wednesday period, to the sequence of topics as proposed. If we think, and it's better on a Tuesday, to have some of the topics that we expect the Conference Board and PAG members are interested in take place and get discussed that day as opposed to Wednesday, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to accommodate that and move some of the agency reports to a different period, because there's no logic, in my view, that we have to have the agency reports first before we discuss other issues. I recall, by the way, that we had raised eyebrows in the past about whether we needed as many agency reports as we've had, and that's another open question. I don't want to sort of point out, I can't think of any particular one where I'd say really don't need to hear that, but that's part of the issue of consolidation and providing more time to talk about issues that have substantive interest both to the commissioners as well as to other participants. Is, we need to think that through a bit more to see whether we can free up some time, particularly in the context, as we now have, of public comment opportunities for all those sessions. So that's number one. I think we should be open, and we could maybe discuss that further this afternoon, how we might be able to rejig the agenda to accommodate that. Secondly, on the question that Peggy's raised about hearing different points of view from, or changes from various commission discussions that you wanted to have collectively more sense of, it's not clear to me why there isn't what you need from us as far as a decision or direction is here. Obviously, every administrative session is open to the public. You have the opportunity, clearly, both in PAG and Conference Board, to nominate individuals who you say, you spend the next hour at the administrative session and report back, and then somebody else, like a rotating whatever. I mean, you guys are completely in control of that. So I think our role is to try to say, let's try to construct the week in a way that makes it easier for you logistically, given other pressures, as you say, on the Wednesday. And then your role is to nominate the people you want to nominate to participate in our sessions who can report back to yours. And I think that should be also straightforward to do. On the decision table, as the example, and I think, Steve, I think what Peggy was saying was that as we made changes or asked Steve to make change, or asked Ian to make changes, he made the changes, and then you provided those changes to them. So in that sense, the credit was due to both of you. I will not promise to either you or Ian that we'll not ask for further additions to the decision table, but I will say, given what we saw yesterday, that unless we're going to have the entire wall here, 30 feet or longer, available for additions to the decision table, and maybe we should not have that, we'll try to keep those changes to a minimum, but no guarantees.
Thank you. Any further comments? Nobody online? No one in the audience? I see none, so thank you very much. I believe we'll work through the agenda. We'll have, as Michael said, we'll pick up a little bit of this in the afternoon session. We actually have to confirm amongst when the meetings will be, but that won't be secret. It's just finalized. Thank you very much. Oh, Bruce.
Just one additional comment for the web audience. As we did yesterday, we'll make any presentations available as soon as possible, and the recording will be up hopefully sometime early tomorrow morning. That usually takes an overnight thing to get the YouTube recording up. So.
Thank you.
Steve's saying he can get it done today.
Excellent. Okay, thanks. Goodbye to everyone. Thanks for participating.